There is something quietly strange about a show that can make you feel warm and unsettled at the same time. Family Guy has always had that quality. On the surface, it is a cartoon about a bickering, lovable American family doing ridiculous things in a small Rhode Island town. But underneath the laugh track and the cutaway gags and the over-the-top antics, there is a whole other story being told. A story written not in the dialogue, but in the slow, creeping transformation of every character across more than 2 decades of television. And when you sit with that story long enough, when you really follow the thread of who these people were when the show began and who they eventually became, something dark and fascinating starts to emerge. This is not going to be a quick run-through of highlights. Tonight we are going all the way down into the roots of every major character in this show, where they came from, what they were originally designed to be, what happened to them along the way, and what their stories, when taken together, actually reveal about the strange, complicated, occasionally brilliant, and sometimes deeply troubled creative machine that kept churning out episodes for over 25 years. So settle in. Let the night get comfortable around you, because we have a lot of ground to cover, and most of it is more interesting than you might expect. Part 1. The birth of the Griffins, where it all came from. The story of Family Guy does not begin in a writer's room or a Fox network meeting. It begins with a young man at art school in Providence, Rhode Island, staying up late in a cramped dorm room, drawing characters that would eventually become one of the most recognizable animated families in television history. Seth MacFarlane enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design in the early 1990s. RISD, as it is known to those who go there, is one of the most prestigious art and design schools in the world. Located in Providence, the same city that would eventually give a fictional address to the Griffin family, RISD is not the kind of place you end up by accident. You go there because you have something specific to say visually, and you need the tools and the environment to say it. MacFarlane had been drawing cartoons essentially his entire life. By the time he arrived at RISD, he already had a clear aesthetic sensibility and a particular sense of humor that was hard to pin down, something that mixed absurdist comedy with genuine warmth, sharp cultural observation with goofy slapstick, and character-driven storytelling, with complete willingness to abandon narrative coherence for the sake of a good joke. While he was still a student, MacFarlane began working at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio responsible for some of the most beloved cartoons of the 20th century. His work there was not glamorous by any measure. He was doing small jobs on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. But working at a real animation studio, even on relatively small assignments, gave him an education that you simply cannot get in a classroom. He learned how a professional animation production actually works. He learned the rhythms of scripted comedy. He learned what made a character function as a recurring presence across many episodes, rather than just in a single sketch. During those early years, he created 2 short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. These shorts featured a middle-aged man named Larry and his talking dog named Steve. If you have ever watched them, and they are out there to find, if you are curious, the resemblance to what would become Peter and Brian Griffin is immediately obvious. Larry is a heavy-set, not particularly bright, warm-hearted regular guy. Steve is the intellectual dog who serves as his more thoughtful companion. The dynamic between them is almost exactly the same as the one that would define the early seasons of Family Guy. MacFarlane took those 2 characters, refined them, built a whole family structure around them, and pitched the concept to Fox in May of 1998. The pitch itself is part of television legend. MacFarlane created a 7-minute animated pilot entirely by hand in his apartment over a period of about 3 months. Fox executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden watched it and immediately saw something in it. They greenlit the series and gave MacFarlane a development deal that was, for the time, remarkably generous. He received a $2 million per season contract while he was still in his mid-20s. Family Guy was not a slow burn that gradually found its footing. It launched with real money, real ambition, and a creator who had thought through every detail of his world carefully before a single frame of broadcast animation was produced. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999. Not a random Sunday night in the dead of winter, but immediately following Super Bowl 33. That placement was intentional and it was significant. The Super Bowl is the single most watched television event in the United States every year, And any show given the post-game slot is essentially handed the largest possible audience on a silver platter. The first episode of Family Guy pulled in approximately 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated comedy, that was a staggering debut. The world MacFarlane introduced that night was the fictional town of Quahog, and in this script we will be calling it simply The Town, or The Griffin's Town, following our channel's style. The Griffin family lived at 31 Spooner Street and consisted of Peter, a heavy-set Irish-American factory worker with a thick New England accent and the decision-making skills of a golden retriever. His wife Lois, a stay-at-home mother from a wealthy background who played piano and tried to keep the household from falling into complete chaos. Their teenage daughter Meg, who just wanted to be normal and was never quite allowed to be. Their son Chris, a big-hearted, slightly awkward kid who was in many ways a younger version of his father. Their infant son Stewie, who was secretly an evil genius plotting world domination and the death of his mother. And Brian, the family dog, who walked on two legs, drank martinis, drove a car, had a dry wit that could cut glass, and was quite possibly the most emotionally intelligent being in the entire household. Peter's voice was something MacFarlane had been carrying around in his head for a long time before the show aired. He has described it as an impression of a certain kind of New England working-class man, not stupid in a contemptible way, but unfiltered in a way that was simultaneously infuriating and endearing. The voice of Peter Griffin was partly inspired by a security guard MacFarlane knew at RISD. There was something about the way that man spoke, with no internal editor between thought and mouth, that MacFarlane found both hilarious and oddly human. Brian's voice is essentially MacFarlane's own speaking voice, slightly adjusted. Stewie was modeled on the clipped, theatrical delivery of Rex Harrison, particularly his performance in the 1964 film My Fair Lady. Alex Borstein, who voiced Lois, based the character's nasal New England accent on a cousin of hers from Long Island. And Seth Green, who voiced Chris Griffin, has said that his character's vocal quality came partly from his impression of a specific type of slightly dazed, affable young man and partly from improvisation during auditions that just happened to click. These were not arbitrary casting choices. Every voice in the original Griffin family was chosen with an ear for how the characters would interact, how they would bounce off each other, how their tones and rhythms would create a specific kind of domestic music. When Peter's booming, thoughtless declarations collided with Lois's slightly exasperated practicality, something funny happened almost automatically. When Stewie's theatrical menace landed in the same room as Brian's dry world weariness, the contrast produced humor that was almost mathematical in its reliability. And then there was the supporting world built around the Griffins. Glenn Quagmire, the next-door neighbor and Peter's closest friend outside the household, was an airline pilot with an almost supernatural obsession with sexual conquest. His voice, also provided by MacFarlane, was modeled on the lounge singer aesthetic of 1950s, America all swagger and innuendo, and the faint smell of cologne applied with too heavy a hand. Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer who lived next door on the other side, was voiced by Patrick Warburton in a performance of such confident, square-jawed absurdity that it became one of the most memorable comedy voices in television history. And Cleveland Brown, the soft-spoken, gentle-natured neighbor across the street, was a character who served as a kind of human anchor in a neighborhood full of people operating at maximum chaotic volume. The world was populated carefully. Every character had a function, every relationship had a dynamic, and at the center of all of it was a family messy, funny, occasionally touching, and animated with enough real feeling that audiences responded to them as though they were real people they actually knew. The first season of Family Guy ranked 33rd in the Nielsen ratings. 12.8 million households tuned in on average. For a new animated comedy, those were solid numbers. Not dominance, but establishment. The show had found its audience quickly, and that audience was genuinely invested. People were talking about Family Guy the way you talk about something that feels fresh, something that is doing something a little different from what came before. The writing staff that MacFarlane assembled for those early seasons included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These were people who shared MacFarlane's particular sensibility, people who understood that the show's brand of humor required a specific combination of anarchic energy and genuine warmth to work. The comedy could be dark, could be offensive, could leap off in completely unexpected directions at any moment, but it had to land somewhere that felt real. It had to have roots. What made the early episodes of Family Guy feel different from other animated comedies of the time was something that is surprisingly hard to define in technical terms. The Simpsons had been on the air for a decade by the time Family Guy premiered, and its influence was impossible to ignore. South Park had launched 2 years earlier and was doing something that felt genuinely transgressive. King of the Hill was finding poetry in the quiet dignity of ordinary suburban life. Family Guy fit somewhere among all of these but was not quite any of them. It had The Simpsons' fondness for the American family as comedic lens, but was louder and more willing to abandon internal logic for a good gag. It had some of South Park's provocateur spirit, but lacked that show's laser focus on satirical intent. It had a specific visual aesthetic that was all its own, cleaner than The Simpsons, more fluid than South Park, with character designs that were simple enough to be expressive across a huge range of emotional states. And underneath all of it, the show had something that its critics often missed and its defenders always pointed to. It genuinely cared about its characters. When Peter messed up in those first 3 seasons, you felt it. When Brian failed at something, you winced a little on his behalf. When Meg was left out, there was a tiny sting of recognition in it that went beyond the joke. The show was not using these characters as props for humor. It was building a world with them and inviting the audience into that world. And the audience accepted the invitation in numbers that surprised almost everyone. Then Fox, being Fox, began shuffling the show around the schedule. Season 2 moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 p.m., directly opposite Frasier, one of the most popular comedies on NBC at the time. The ratings dropped. Fox moved the show again to Tuesday nights, where it was beaten by Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Each move made it harder for the audience to find the show. Each drop in ratings made the network more nervous. By the end of Season 3 in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. The show was done, except it was not done. What happened next was one of the most remarkable reversals in the history of American television. Cartoon Network bought the rights to air reruns of Family Guy on their late-night Adult Swim programming block, and they got those rights for almost nothing because nobody thought the show had much value anymore. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Family Guy became the highest-rated show on the entire Adult Swim block. It boosted the network's late-night viewership by 239%. Simultaneously, the DVD releases of the first and second seasons sold over 400,000 copies, a remarkable number for a canceled cartoon. A cult following had been building quietly during the cancellation. The audience that had watched the show during its original run had not forgotten it, and a new generation of viewers, discovering it through Adult Swim reruns late at night in their dorm rooms and basements and living rooms, was falling for it hard. By 2004, Fox had noticed. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice reversed course and ordered new episodes. Season 4 would air in 2005. Fans were ecstatic. But as we will spend the rest of this journey exploring, the show that came back in 2005 was already subtly different from the show that had left in 2002. And those differences would compound over the years in ways that would slowly, methodically, alter every single character in the Griffin family in ways that the original writers might not have recognized. Before we go deeper into the characters themselves, drop a comment right now and let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where this community reaches. And if you have not subscribed yet, hitting that button costs you nothing and it helps this channel keep making content exactly like this. Part 2, Peter Griffin, the lovable fool in his purest form. Before Peter Griffin became what he eventually became, and we will get to that, he was something genuinely special in the landscape of animated comedy. He was a type of character that the medium had seen before but had never quite assembled in exactly this way. The lovable idiot. The man who means well and causes destruction. The father whose heart is genuinely in the right place, even when everything else about him is in entirely the wrong place. To understand why Peter worked so brilliantly in seasons 1 through 3, you have to think carefully about what the character was actually built from. Peter Loewenbroy Griffin, that middle name given to him in a society gathering in early season 2, promptly never used again, was a working-class Irish-American man living in a mid-sized town in Rhode Island. He worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory for the first 3 seasons, reporting to the bizarre Mr. Weed. He drank beer with his friends at the Drunken Clam. He watched television in his living room with the kind of absorption that suggested the outside world was slightly more than he could comfortably process. He loved Lois with the uncomplicated sincerity of a man who genuinely could not believe his luck at having married her, even decades into the marriage. He loved his children with a warmth that his intelligence could not always translate into appropriate expressions of fatherhood. The key to Peter's comedy in those early years was a distinction that sounds simple but is actually quite delicate: the difference between a character who does stupid things and a character who does cruel things. Early Peter was entirely in the first category. His disasters came from genuine gaps in his understanding of the world, not from malice or selfishness. When Peter did something that caused harm, and he caused harm constantly, because that was the premise of his existence, it was always because he had not thought the situation through, not because he did not care about the people around him. The moment the smoke cleared, he would feel something: guilt, regret, the vague but real awareness that he had made a mess, and he would try to fix it. There is an episode in season 1 called "I Never Met the Dead Man," in which Peter accidentally destroys the town's cable television, and its residents are forced to rediscover the pleasures of human interaction. The comedy of the episode comes from Peter's dependency on television being played as an addiction, but what holds the episode together emotionally is Peter's relationship with Meg throughout. She is neglected in the background of most of the episode's chaos, but at no point does anyone in the Griffin household actively despise her. She is simply the teenager in the corner of a family that runs at high volume. That specificity, the way the early show understood Meg's pain without weaponizing it, is something that would later disappear almost entirely, but in those first 3 seasons it grounded the family in something recognizable. Peter's dynamic with Brian in the early seasons was the emotional core of the show in ways that often get overlooked in retrospect. Their friendship was the beating heart of Family Guy's original premise. Brian was the voice of reason. Peter was the engine of chaos. Brian would see what Peter was about to do, would understand with precise clarity why it was a terrible idea, would explain this in the most reasonable possible terms, and then would watch Peter do it anyway. And then Brian would be there to help him through the consequences. It was a friendship rooted in genuine affection. Peter valued Brian's intelligence even when he ignored it. Brian valued Peter's warmth even when he found it maddening. They needed each other in the specific way that people who are very different need each other, each providing something the other lacks, each softening the other's most extreme qualities. The physical comedy built around Peter in those first 3 seasons was also calibrated differently than it would become later. Peter falling down was funny because of timing and exaggeration. Peter getting into the recurring fight sequences with the giant chicken, those epic, city-destroying brawls that would occasionally break out across entire neighborhoods, worked because they were absurd in a way that was clearly, proudly, flagrantly animated. You never forgot you were watching a cartoon. The violence was cartoonish violence, the kind that lives in a space entirely separate from the real world. Nobody got hurt in any way that felt uncomfortable to watch. The show understood that physical comedy and animation exists in its own dimension, and it exploited that dimension with real joy. What made Peter lovable, rather than merely funny, was those moments of genuine feeling scattered through the chaos. In Season 2's Da Boom, the Griffin family survives what they believe is a nuclear apocalypse and must start rebuilding civilization. Through everything, Peter's instinct is to keep his family together. His judgment is as bad as it has ever been. He leads them in wildly wrong directions, makes decisions that serve his immediate impulses, rather than the family's long-term well-being. But his intention is always, clearly, to take care of these people. In Season 3's Road to Rhode Island, it is Brian whose emotional story takes center stage, as he travels to find the mother he was taken from as a puppy, but Peter's presence in the background of the episode is characterized by a steady, uncomplicated affection. He does not need to understand Brian's pain to stand beside him in it. Peter's relationship with Lois in those early seasons was one of genuine partnership, albeit a lopsided one. Lois was clearly the more capable, more thoughtful, more strategically intelligent half of the marriage. She had grown up wealthy, had given that up to be with Peter, and had built a family life that required constant maintenance against the entropy her husband generated daily. But she loved him. That was never in question in the early seasons. The love between Peter and Lois was the gravitational center of the entire show, and when it wobbled, when they fought, when they drifted, the episodes always pulled them back together. Peter would realize, in his own slow and blunt way, that he had been wrong. He would tell Lois he loved her. She would believe him, because the evidence was everywhere, even buried under all the nonsense. There was also a surprising depth in Peter's relationships with his children in those early seasons. Not sophistication, Peter was never going to be the kind of father who sat down and had a nuanced conversation about life, but real feeling. In Season 2's Peter, Caviar Eater, Peter enters the world of Lois's wealthy family for a party and spends the episode trying to fit in with people who regard him with barely concealed contempt. At the end, he delivers a small speech about who he is that is not impressive or eloquent but is completely, unmistakably genuine. He is Peter Griffin. He lives on Spooner Street. He has a wife and 3 kids who he loves. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. That version of Peter, unsophisticated but sincere, oblivious but warm, chaotic but fundamentally good, was what the audience fell in love with during those first 3 seasons. And it is what makes his eventual transformation so jarring to watch if you go back and compare the early episodes to the later ones. The seeds of that transformation were always present, of course. Peter was never entirely without edge. He had moments of selfishness, moments of thoughtlessness that went beyond mere stupidity. But in the first 3 seasons, these were genuinely exceptions to his established character. They were the notes that gave the instrument its range, not the melody itself. What the early seasons understood, and what the later seasons would forget, is that a lovable fool is only lovable if the fool part is doing work in service of the lovable part. Peter's stupidity was funny because it was the vehicle through which his genuine affection for the world expressed itself in disastrously wrong ways. Take away the affection, and what you have is just a man making bad decisions with no internal compass and no real stake in whether anyone around him is okay. That is a very different character. And it is the character that Peter Griffin would slowly, steadily become. Part 3. Peter Griffin, The Long and Painful Collapse. Season 4 premiered in 2005 and it came back to enormous fanfare. Fox placed Family Guy as the centerpiece of its animation domination Sunday night lineup, alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and the brand new McFarlane series American Dad. The ratings for the Season 4 premiere were strong. The hype was real, the fans showed up, but something in the writing room had changed. Part of this was structural and unavoidable. The 3-year gap between Season 3's cancellation and Season 4's premiere had scattered the original writing staff. When a show gets canceled, its writers do not sit on their hands waiting for a miracle. They find other work. They move on to other projects. Some stayed connected to Family Guy in various ways, but the room that came back for Season 4 was not identical to the room that had created Seasons 1 through 3. New writers brought new sensibilities. New voices meant a slight shift in the frequency the show broadcast on. And that shift, subtle in Season 4, would become more pronounced with every subsequent season. The first thing that began changing with Peter was the baseline of his intelligence. In the original seasons, Peter was dumb in a way that felt grounded. He misunderstood things because he had not thought carefully about them, not because he was incapable of basic cognitive function. Starting with Season 4, his intelligence began to drop to levels that strained plausibility. He started doing things that a person who managed to hold a job and sustain a marriage and raise children simply could not do if his brain truly worked the way the show was now depicting. The stupidity went from being a quality, something that colored his character, to being his entire defining trait, with everything else receding to accommodate it. Then came the shift in moral center. In Season 4 and into Season 5, there were episodes where Peter did things that the first 3 seasons' version of him would simply not have done. Not because he was too good a person to do them, but because he was someone who cared about the consequences of his actions, even if imperfectly and incompletely. The new Peter was beginning to show a capacity for genuine selfishness, not the accidental kind that came from obliviousness, but the deliberate kind that came from a character who was starting to prioritize his own immediate desires over anyone else's well-being. By Season 8, the transformation was essentially complete, and it had happened gradually enough that if you had watched every episode in sequence, you might not have had a clear moment to point to and say, "This is where it happened." That gradual quality is actually what makes the change so effective at escaping notice in the moment. You adapt to it episode by episode. It is only when you compare Season 1 Peter to Season 10 Peter directly that the gulf becomes undeniable. The Peter Griffin of Season 8 and beyond was a man who could push his wife into potential danger and flee without looking back, who could steal candy from his infant son as a matter of course, who could sabotage his friend's marriage without any apparent understanding of why that might be wrong, who could treat his daughter with open and deliberate cruelty and then laugh at her when she confronted him about it. These are not the actions of a lovable fool. They are the actions of a person who has lost something essential, a fundamental orientation toward the people in his life, as people rather than as scenery. The episode from Season 10 called Seahorse Seashell Party is the clearest possible statement of where Peter had arrived by that point. In it, Meg Griffin finally breaks. After years of accumulated mistreatment from her entire family, she snaps and delivers a speech to each of them in turn, cataloging the specific ways they have failed her and everyone around them. She turns to Peter and says, in essence, what every viewer had been thinking for years. He has no education, he has no interests. He does whatever reckless thing he wants whenever he wants it without regard for anyone else. He terrorizes the community. He farted in his daughter's face for entertainment. If anyone from the outside world could see how he treated her, he would be in jail. And Peter laughs. He finds it amusing. He is not hurt. He is not moved. He does not experience anything that even remotely resembles the guilt or remorse that early Peter would have felt hearing those words from his daughter. He laughs. That laugh is the clearest single moment in the entire show that marks the distance between who Peter was and who he became. The early Peter would have been devastated to hear those words from Meg. His response to having his failures laid out that plainly would have been defensive, confused, sad, probably all three in awkward combination. But it would have been a human response. The later Peter has no such response available to him, because somewhere in the years between Season 1 and Season 10, whatever mechanism connected Peter's actions to his feelings about the people those actions affected had been quietly switched off. The physical violence that Peter engaged in also escalated dramatically over the middle and later seasons. In the early years, the show's physical comedy was standard animated slapstick, exaggerated, clearly cartoonish, completely removed from real consequence. Gradually, the violence became more graphic and more specific. The injuries depicted on screen became more realistic, more detailed, more centered on actual bodily harm rather than cartoon physics. Characters were shown with wounds that were drawn with unsettling care, and Peter was often at the center of this shift, either as the agent of the violence or as its target, with the show presenting both versions as equally valid sources of comedy. What makes this particularly troubling from a character standpoint is that it reinforced the shift in Peter's moral core. In the early seasons, Peter's physical mishaps happened to him. The world was physically aggressive toward Peter in the way that the world is physically aggressive toward all cartoon protagonists. In the later seasons, Peter increasingly inflicted physical harm on others, on his friends, on his daughter, on random bystanders, and the show expected the audience to receive this as comedy rather than as the behavior of someone who needed to be stopped. His relationship with Joe Swanson illustrates this well. When Joe was introduced in Season 1 in the episode A Hero Sits Next Door, Peter was actually jealous of Joe. Joe was the cool new neighbor who everyone in the community admired. He was tough and capable and respected, and the fact that he used a wheelchair did not diminish him in any way in the eyes of the community. If anything, it seemed to make people admire him more because he had overcome something that would have stopped a lesser person. Peter's jealousy was funny precisely because it was petty and human and completely misplaced. Over the years, Joe went from being the person Peter envied to being a person Peter treated with barely concealed contempt. The disability that had made Joe admirable in the early seasons became a recurring target for mockery. His friendships deteriorated. His marriage suffered. And Peter, who had once envied Joe's popularity, became one of the most consistent sources of the mockery directed at him. One of the few times the show attempted to explain Peter's behavior rather than simply exhibit it came in the Season 14 episode Peter's Sister, in which Peter's sister, Karen Griffin, visits the family for Thanksgiving. The episode reveals that Karen had been physically and emotionally abusive to Peter when they were children. She bullied him relentlessly. She mocked him, hurt him, made him feel worthless. And the episode suggests that this cycle of abuse is part of why Peter treats Meg the way he does, that what Karen did to him, he then inflicted on his own daughter, passing the wound down through the generation. Meg, learning this, finds compassion for her father. They reconcile. It is a genuinely moving episode, and it provides a real psychological framework for Peter's behavior that the show had never previously articulated. And then the next episode aired, and Peter was treating Meg exactly as he had before, and the reconciliation existed in the past like a footnote that nobody in the writer's room was planning to reference again. That is the specific kind of creative failure that defined Peter's character through most of the show's run. The writers knew, clearly, that Peter's behavior needed explanation and could be given one. They could write a genuinely good episode about it. But writing that episode did not obligate them to change anything, because the show operated on a reset mechanism that wiped consequences between episodes. Peter could learn something on Tuesday and be exactly the same person the following week. The show treated its characters like a video game that reloads to the last save point. Whatever happened in the episode you just watched is contained there, and none of it carries forward into the next one. This is the structural problem that underlies all of Peter's character degradation. He cannot grow because the show will not allow growth. He cannot change because the premise requires him to remain the same. But the version of himself that the premise required him to remain gradually shifted from someone you wanted to invite into your living room to someone you would cross the street to avoid, and the audience noticed. Slowly, over years, the polling of fan sentiment around Peter Griffin shifted from affection to something more complicated and less warm. The lovable fool had become something else. Something that wore the lovable fool's clothes and spoke in the lovable fool's voice but did not share his fundamental decency. And that substitution, made one small decision at a time, across many seasons, is one of the saddest things that happened to this show. Part 4. Lois Griffin, the heart that hardened over time. Lois Patrice Pewterschmidt Griffin was, in the first seasons of Family Guy, the closest thing the show had to a genuine moral authority. She was not a perfect person. The show made sure of that from the beginning, giving her moments of vanity and ambition and impatience that kept her from feeling like a saint surrounded by sinners. But she was grounded. She was the line. When Peter went too far, Lois pulled him back. When the children needed someone to actually see them rather than look through them, Lois was there. When the family needed direction, Lois provided it. Alex Borstein has been in the role since the very beginning. Her voice, modeled on a cousin from Long Island, gave Lois a specific texture, nasal and slightly harried but never unpleasant, with a musicality that carried affection even when the dialogue was delivering criticism. Borstein has described discovering the voice as somewhat accidental, something she fell into during auditions rather than something she consciously engineered, and there is something right about that. Lois feels like a person who emerged, rather than a character who was constructed. In the first season, Lois was deliberately underwritten compared to Peter and Brian and Stewie. The premise of the show positioned Peter as the engine of chaos, Brian as the voice of reason, and Stewie as the wild card, and Lois served initially as the patient center around which all of that revolved. She was the housewife, the piano teacher, the woman who held the domestic world together with both hands while her husband was busy dismantling it. In lesser hands, that setup would have made her nothing more than a foil. But the writing, even in those first episodes, kept finding small moments that reminded you there was a whole person inside the role. Her background was deliberately ironic. Lois grew up wealthy. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, was the kind of rich that expressed itself as contempt for everyone who was not equally rich. Her mother, Barbara, was a woman of aristocratic refinement who had never quite reconciled herself to her daughter marrying a factory worker from Providence. Lois had chosen Peter, deliberately chosen him over the life her parents had designed for her, chosen him knowing exactly what he was, chosen him with eyes open to his many limitations, because she loved something in him that she could not find in the world she came from. That backstory, when it was allowed to breathe in the early episodes, gave Lois a complexity that most animated comedy wives never get. She was not trapped in her marriage. She had chosen it, and the choice said something interesting about who she was. Her talent as a piano teacher was another detail the early seasons used with care. The show would occasionally return to the piano, to Lois playing, to Lois teaching in ways that reminded you she had a life and an identity outside of managing the Griffin household. She had skill. She had something that was hers. In later seasons, this would quietly fade away, appearing so rarely that it started to feel like a detail the writers had simply stopped caring about. The transformation of Lois over the middle seasons was less dramatic than Peter's, but in some ways more disorienting, because the change was less about her becoming louder or more destructive, and more about her becoming colder. The warmth that defined early Lois, the genuine, sometimes exhausted but always real love she had for her chaotic family, began to recede. In its place came something more detached. A Lois who treated her daughter with open contempt in ways that the first season version of her would have pushed back against immediately. A Lois who seemed in certain episodes to be participating in the family's dysfunction rather than serving as its check on that dysfunction. Her relationship with Meg is perhaps the most useful lens through which to track this change. In the first 3 seasons, Lois's relationship with Meg was imperfect but fundamentally loving. She was not always attentive. She did not always see Meg clearly, but the love was there, and it would occasionally surface in moments of real tenderness that gave the relationship dimension. As the seasons progressed, Lois's treatment of Meg became steadily colder. There were episodes in the middle stretch where Lois would do things to Meg, say things to her, about her, in front of her that crossed into genuine maternal failure, rather than the ordinary chaos of a disorganized family. There is a moment in one of the later middle seasons where Lois, in the context of a conversation about Meg's romantic prospects, actually encourages Meg towards self-destruction rather than stepping in as the kind of mother who would recognize her daughter was in pain. It is presented in a throwaway way, almost as a casual cruelty rather than a dramatic one, and that casualness is precisely what makes it disturbing. The early Lois would have noticed Meg's pain. She would have done something about it, even if imperfectly. The middle season, Lois had somehow stopped noticing. What the writers eventually recognized, and this is worth crediting, was that Lois worked better as a character when she had some of her original moral authority restored. Starting around season 21 and into season 22, there was a visible effort to bring Lois back closer to her original characterization. The episode Snap Pole Decision from the later seasons features Lois taking Meg on a tropical vacation, genuinely trying to connect with her daughter, and at one point telling their kidnappers that they can do whatever they want to her if they let Meg go. That moment, the mother putting herself between her child and danger, is pure first-season Lois. It lands because the character still contains the capacity for that kind of love, even after seasons of having it buried. But the distance between who Lois was at her best and who she became at her worst is significant and worth sitting with. Her musical talents disappeared. Her moral backbone softened. Her love for her husband sometimes expressed itself as participation in his worst impulses, rather than resistance to them. The woman who had chosen Peter with clear eyes, who had known exactly what she was getting and loved it anyway, became someone who seemed at times as lost in the Griffin family's entropy as everyone else. She also became the subject of an interesting counter-narrative among a subset of critics and fans, because Lois's character arc, seen from one angle, could be read as one of the most genuinely developed in the entire show. Her hidden past kept being excavated across the seasons: the pornographic film she made in college, the lesbian experiences she had at Salve Regina University, the mean girl history from high school that eventually caught up with her in the form of Joyce Kinney, a newscaster who had never forgotten what Lois had done to her. These revelations gave Lois texture in ways that felt less like flanderization and more like genuine character excavation. There was a real person in there, complicated and imperfect, and occasionally capable of real cruelty, but also capable of real love. The tension in Lois's character is that both of these things are true simultaneously. She is one of the most underused characters in the show's entire run, and she is also one of the most genuinely interesting. The early seasons planted seeds that should have grown into something rich over 25 years. Some of those seeds did produce fruit. Most of them were left to wither while the show concentrated its attention elsewhere. Alex Borstein has given Lois nearly 3 decades of consistent, intelligent voice work. In the recording booth, Lois has always had someone who understood her. On the page, in the writer's room, she has not always been as well served. The gap between the voice actress's commitment to the character and what the character has actually been given to do is one of Family Guy's quiet wastes. Part 5. Brian Griffin, the voice that lost its own meaning. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Brian Griffin was the most admirable character on the show. He was not the funniest, and he was not the most dramatic, but he was the one who felt most like a person you might actually want to know. He was the one you rooted for in a way that was quiet and steady, without the theatrical intensity of Stewie's schemes or the operatic chaos of Peter's disasters. Brian was a dog who walked on 2 legs and drank martinis and drove a car and sometimes behaved in ways that reminded you he was a dog, and then a few seconds later would say something so precise and observant that you forgot everything else. McFarlane voices him in essentially his own speaking voice, lower than Peter's cartoon boom, more measured, drier. And that dryness was the key to early Brian. He was a man, and the show always treated him as a man, dog status notwithstanding, who had seen enough of the world to be under no illusions about it, but who had not yet let that knowledge curdle into cynicism. He had warmth, he had loyalty. He had the specific kind of melancholy that attaches itself to people who are more perceptive than their circumstances reward them for being. He was a failed writer. That detail was established early and maintained with some consistency through the early seasons. Brian had been working on a novel for years without finishing it. He drank more than he should, which was a character note played both for laughs and for the occasional moment of real vulnerability. He had feelings for Lois that he kept mostly controlled, though they would surface in glances and brief expressions that added a layer of complicated longing to every scene between them. He was unlucky in love. His romantic relationships in the early seasons followed a pattern of genuine hope, followed by circumstances that undid everything. And you felt the weight of each failure because the show let you see Brian feeling it too. What made Brian the most human character in the show was this accumulation of genuine feeling around his failures. He was not a bad person. He was a good person, kind, loyal, intelligent, capable of real empathy, who was unable to get his life to cooperate with his hopes for it. That is a condition that an enormous number of people recognize from the inside, and the show allowed Brian to inhabit it without judgment or ridicule. His failures were funny, yes, but they were funny in the way that the failures of people you genuinely like can be funny. You laugh, but there is also a wince in it, a recognition that the person deserves better than they are getting. The first major shift in Brian began with the show's return in season 4. His liberal politics, which had been a small flavor note in the original seasons, began occupying more and more of the character's available space. Brian had always been liberal. He had always had strong opinions about social issues. But in the original run, this was one quality among many that made him who he was. After the revival, his politics started to feel less like a dimension of the character and more like the character's primary purpose. Entire scenes would be built around Brian delivering speeches about whatever political issue was on the writers' minds that week. The effect was less like watching a character express his views, and more like watching a character who had been hollowed out to serve as a vehicle for the writer's views. Even viewers who agreed with Brian's political positions found this annoying because it felt dishonest. The original Brian engaged with the world through the filter of his whole personality. The post-revival Brian increasingly engaged with it through the single filter of his political identity. The rest of him, the writer, the romantic, the loyal friend, the quietly melancholy figure drinking alone at the bar, started getting crowded out. What followed over the next several seasons was one of the most thorough character transformations in animated television history. The Brian who had been defined by genuine intelligence, genuine kindness, and genuine loyalty became someone who was defined by the pretense of those qualities without their substance. He talked endlessly about being a great writer without having written anything worth reading. He positioned himself as morally superior to the people around him while doing things that were substantially worse than what most of them had done. He cultivated the aesthetic of an intellectual without doing the actual work of thinking. The episode Brian Writes a Bestseller from Season 9 is often cited as the clearest marker of this transition. Stewie, recognizing Brian's long-standing struggle with his novel, encourages him to write a self-help book instead. Brian takes the encouragement and writes a book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, which becomes a massive bestseller. The success is real. And Brian's response to it is to become, almost instantaneously, one of the most unbearable people on television. He treats Stewie, the one who believed in him, the one who sparked the whole thing, with open contempt. He becomes arrogant about a book that even he must know, at some level, represents a kind of surrender of everything he actually valued about himself as a writer. He had always wanted to be taken seriously as a literary figure, and instead he had written a self-help book that sold millions of copies, and his response was to wear the success as armor against everyone who had ever doubted him, rather than to examine what it actually said about the gap between his aspirations and his reality. After that episode, Brian's behavior in subsequent seasons continued in the same direction. He gave Stewie a baby herpes, and then treated the situation as largely inconsequential. He destroyed Stewie's beloved stuffed bear Rupert in a moment of drunk pettiness. He let a woman and her child drown because, upon learning she was married, he decided she was not worth rescuing. He sold Quagmire, a man who had genuinely helped him a dilapidated property through deliberate deception. He stole Stewie's jokes for a stand-up comedy routine. He claimed Stewie's time machine as his own invention on at least 2 occasions. The list of things Brian did in the later seasons that the original Brian would have found morally repugnant is long and specific and hard to dismiss. The Quagmire speech from Season 8's Jerome is the New Black became one of the most famous moments in the show's later run precisely because it was accurate. Quagmire, who is many things but is not someone you would normally turn to for moral clarity, delivers a detailed and devastating critique of Brian's character. He calls Brian a fraud. He calls him a phony intellectual who has not actually accomplished anything. He calls him out for the constant low-grade pursuit of Lois right in front of Peter. He calls him a bad father. Brian did, at one point, father a son named Dylan, and his parenting was, as one could predict. Every specific accusation in the speech is backed up by things the show had actually depicted, and the speech lands with such power because the audience is meant to feel, watching it, that someone has finally said the thing out loud. What is genuinely strange about the Quagmire speech is what it reveals about the writer's awareness of what they had done to Brian. They knew. They could see it clearly enough to write a character delivering a full analysis of it. And they chose to use that moment not as a turning point for Brian's character, but as a kind of pressure valve. Let Quagmire say it, let the audience feel heard, and then continue exactly as before. Brian did not change meaningfully after the speech. If anything, his subsequent treatment of Quagmire in the seasons that followed became pettier and more antagonistic, as though the speech had triggered a personal grievance that Brian was now committed to avenging rather than a self-reflection he was committed to acting on. The death of Brian Griffin in Season 12's Life of Brian sent genuine shockwaves through the fanbase. The episode depicted Brian being struck by a car in front of Stewie, dying, and being mourned by the entire Griffin family. A new dog named Vinny was introduced as his replacement. Fans petitioned for Brian's return. The episode trended on social media. The death made national news. 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie used time travel to go back and save Brian before the accident. Brian returned. Everything reset. The death had lasted 3 weeks in television time and had been undone almost before the grief had settled. The backlash to this was significant and telling. The audience had been manipulated. They had been made to feel something real, the loss of a character they had known for over a decade, and then the feeling had been pulled out from under them as a ratings exercise. It was the most explicit possible statement of the show's relationship with consequence. Nothing had to mean anything. Any dramatic weight could be removed as quickly as it was applied. The death and resurrection of Brian Griffin was not a story decision. It was a marketing decision, and viewers are remarkably good at telling the difference. After his return, Brian somehow continued to deteriorate. The traits that had made him insufferable in the middle seasons became more extreme. His self-awareness, which had occasionally surfaced in poignant moments of genuine honesty, became rarer. His capacity for cruelty, which had grown steadily, continued its trajectory. The character who had once been the most relatable presence in the entire show had become someone viewers watched through narrowed eyes, waiting to see what he would do wrong next. What happened to Brian Griffin is the story of a character who was written as a specific kind of person, flawed but good, struggling but genuine, and then gradually had his goodness drained and his flaws amplified until the ratio inverted completely. The writers kept the shape of Brian, kept the voice and the aesthetic and the surface characteristics, but changed what was inside. And the result was a character who looked like Brian and sounded like Brian, but who had the moral architecture of someone else entirely. Part 6. Stewie Griffin, the genius they could not hold on to. You could make a reasonable argument that Stewie Griffin was the single most original animated character of the late 1990s. There is nothing quite like him in the history of the medium. A 1-year-old infant, still in diapers, still being fed pureed food in a high chair, still carried around by his mother like a small warm bundle, and inside all of that, a mind of genuinely staggering sophistication. A British accent acquired from no discernible source. An arsenal of futuristic weapons constructed in his bedroom between nap times, a passionate dedication to the elimination of his mother and the conquest of the human race. The comedy of early Stewie was built entirely on contrast. The contrast between his appearance tiny, round-headed, toddling, and his interior reality organized, menacing, theatrical, in his villainy. The contrast between what the audience heard and what most of the other characters heard, because in the early seasons, the adults around Stewie primarily perceived him as a babbling infant rather than an articulate person. The contrast between the mundane texture of family life diaper changes, bedtimes, playground visits, and the fact that the baby being subjected to these indignities was simultaneously plotting the downfall of civilization. MacFarlane has said that Stewie's voice was modeled on Rex Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady, and you can hear it clearly, that same clipped, aristocratic delivery that manages to make every syllable sound like a minor proclamation. When Stewie discussed his plans for world domination, he sounded like a villain from a 1960s spy film who had somehow been miniaturized and deposited in Rhode Island. And the comedy was in the gap between the grandeur of the speeches and the reality of the situation, this magnificent menace being regularly defeated by something as simple as a locked door or an inopportune nap. In Season 1, Stewie's evil was his defining characteristic in a way that left very little room for anything else. He was the evil baby. That was the premise, the punchline, and the character description all at once. His plans for matricide were not metaphors or dark comedy. Shorthand, they were literal. He built actual working weapons. He had schematics. He had timetables. He had contingency plans. In the episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang from Season 1, Stewie hires a cult to distract Lois so he can escape having to attend his own birthday party, which he regards as a waste of time that could be better spent on his work. The episode is a perfect encapsulation of the early Stewie formula: elaborate planning, theatrical malevolence, and the baby's utter seriousness about things that are inherently absurd. His relationship with Lois in those early seasons was a masterpiece of dramatic irony, the audience knowing something the character did not. Lois adored Stewie. She picked him up and cooed at him, and sang to him, and fed him, and dressed him in his little overalls, entirely oblivious to the fact that the child in her arms considered her his primary obstacle and his most desired target. Every interaction between them was charged with this knowledge on the audience's part. Every hug Lois gave Stewie was also Stewie tolerating proximity to the enemy. Every bedtime routine was also Stewie cataloging vulnerabilities. The tension was so light it barely registered, but it was always there, giving every domestic scene with Stewie an undertow that made it funnier and stranger than a surface reading would suggest. Brian was the one character who consistently understood Stewie, not approved of him, not encouraged him, but understood him, could hear what he was actually saying, could engage with his actual personality rather than the infant surface he presented to the world. That understanding was the foundation of their friendship. And in the early seasons, that friendship was one of the show's most interesting textures. Brian was not charmed by Stewie's evil. He was not particularly alarmed by it either, which said something about Brian's own somewhat detached relationship with conventional morality. He simply engaged with Stewie as the person Stewie was, and that engagement, that willingness to see and be seen accurately, was what Stewie valued about him. The shift in Stewie began in Season 2. The writers started adding moments that hinted at a softer interior beneath the villainy. Small jokes about his femininity. Brief flashes of what might have been vulnerability. The world domination plans were still central, but they were beginning to share space with something else. By Season 3, the something else was taking up more room. Stewie was still evil in Season 3, but he was also, increasingly, a character with feelings specific, particular feelings about particular things that were not purely reducible to his mission. When Season 4 arrived after the cancellation and revival, the shift accelerated dramatically. The writers, including MacFarlane, had come to a clear decision. The evil baby joke had run its course, or at least needed to be substantially reconceived. The world domination plots became less frequent and less central. The attempts on Lois's life faded into occasional callbacks rather than recurring story engines. In their place came something different, a Stewie whose complexity was more emotional than strategic, whose richness came from his interior life rather than his plans. The Stewie and Brian road trip episodes, the Road to specials, that became a recurring format across many seasons, were central to this shift. These episodes gave Brian and Stewie a space to interact outside the constraints of the Griffin household, and the results were often genuinely wonderful. Their dynamic in these specials had something the main show sometimes lacked, a sense of genuine affection between two very different characters who had chosen each other. Brian's world-weary pragmatism and Stewie's theatrical intensity complemented each other in ways that were funny and surprisingly warm. These episodes were some of the best that the post-revival show produced, and they were best specifically because they leaned into the Brian-Stewie relationship rather than using it as backdrop for other stories. But the trade-off for all of this emotional complexity was the abandonment of the original character concept. The evil genius baby who had been so singular, so genuinely unlike anything else on television, was slowly retired. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie was, in retrospect, the show's farewell to that version of Stewie. In those episodes, Stewie finally achieves his goal: he kills Lois, takes over the world, becomes the dictator he had always aspired to be. It is thrilling and funny and appropriately dark, and it gives the audience a version of the payoff they had been waiting for since Season 1. And then it turns out to be a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it happened. Everything reset. And after those episodes, the original evil Stewie largely did not come back. What replaced him was a character who was genuinely interesting in different ways but less irreplaceable. The later Stewie, emotionally complex, increasingly open about his identity, prone to vulnerability and even tenderness, could tell stories that the original Stewie could not. The episode Send in Stewie, Please from Season 16, which places Stewie in extended therapy sessions with a child psychologist and explores his genuine loneliness and his fear of being known, is one of the most ambitious and affecting episodes in the show's history. It would not have been possible with the original, purely villainous Stewie. It required a version of the character who had interior life beyond malice. But there was only ever one baby who built laser guns in his crib and delivered Shakespearean soliloquies about his mother's impending doom while wearing a diaper. The show created something extraordinary and then decided it had used it up. The argument that the evil genius premise was exhausted does not entirely hold up when you consider that the gentler replacement version has sustained 20+ more seasons. If the writers could find that much material for Soft Stewie, the creative imagination that created the original concept could surely have found more to do with it. What the show lost when it retired the original Stewie was the specific kind of comedy that comes from absolute commitment to an absurd premise. The joke was not going to get old because it was not a joke, it was a character. Jokes repeat themselves and become stale. Characters grow and change and generate new situations from their established nature. The evil genius baby was a character with enormous generative potential, and the decision to abandon him for a safer, sweeter alternative is one of the most significant creative choices the show made, and arguably one of its biggest mistakes. That said, the Stewie who exists now, the one getting his own spin-off series announced in March 2026 for a premiere in the 2027-28 television season, is a genuinely compelling figure. He contains multitudes in ways the original did not. He is not just one thing anymore. Whether that complexity compensates for the loss of his singularity is a question every viewer has to answer for themselves. Part 7. Meg Griffin, the character who became a wound. There is something uniquely painful about what happened to Meg Griffin over the course of Family Guy's run. Every other character's degradation involved them becoming more extreme, more exaggerated, more loudly themselves in ways that ultimately undercut what had made them work. Meg's degradation was different. Meg's degradation involved her being erased not as a character who got louder and worse, but as a character who got smaller and smaller until the space where she had been was occupied entirely by a single recurring joke about how little she mattered. She began the show as something familiar and specific, the ordinary teenager in an extraordinary family. Meg Griffin was 16 years old, attending James Woods Regional High School, unpopular in that particular way, that has nothing dramatic about it, no single catastrophic social failure, just the quiet, ongoing experience of being the person who does not quite fit into any of the available categories. She wanted to be liked. She wanted friends. She wanted the romantic attention that seems to attach itself to other people effortlessly but requires elaborate campaign strategies for people like her. She was, in other words, a teenager in the way that is actually most common, which is to say, someone in the long, grinding middle of trying to figure out how to exist in a world that has not yet made clear what role she is supposed to play in it. In Season 1, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert, who was simultaneously appearing on the Fox drama Party of Five. Chabert did 15 episodes of Family Guy before leaving, not because of any conflict or difficulty, but because she was in high school herself, and juggling her drama commitments became impractical. Her departure was amicable. She handed the role off to Mila Kunis, who at the time was best known for her work on That 70s Show, and who was only 15 years old when she first recorded lines as Meg. Kunis has described the character as being perpetually in the state of an awkward teenager, always in the grip of the specific humiliation of that particular life stage. And for the first 3 seasons, that description fit. Meg's situation was played with a kind of recognition that was not unkind. The comedy around her came from the contrast between the normality of her problems and the extremity of her family's circumstances. In a household containing an evil genius baby and a talking dog, and a father who had once inadvertently declared himself a candidate for Congress, Meg's desire to be invited to the right party felt both small and completely legitimate. That contrast was gentle humor. It acknowledged Meg's reality without attacking it. The first signs of change came in Season 4. The jokes about Meg shifted away from her ordinariness and toward her appearance. Characters started making comments about how unattractive she was in ways that had never been part of the original show's approach to her. Physical appearance is different from personality as a target of comedy. A character's personality choices, their reactions to situations, their specific decisions, these are things they could theoretically change. They are about action rather than existence. But appearance, particularly the appearance of a teenage girl, which is already freighted with so much social and psychological weight, is something a character simply is. When the show started making Meg's looks the consistent target of humor, it crossed into a different kind of comedy than the gentle observational comedy of the early seasons. It crossed into the comedy of contempt. Season 5 escalated things further. The family's treatment of Meg began shifting from benign neglect and occasional insensitivity to something that started to look like organized rejection. Peter's comments about Meg went from thoughtless to pointed. The other characters' reactions to her presence began to involve physical expressions of aversion, recoiling, gagging that went beyond cartoon exaggeration, and started to feel like the show had decided to treat Meg as though her existence was a genuine imposition on everyone around her. By seasons 8 through 14, the abuse of Meg Griffin had become one of the defining features of the entire show. Peter would fart in her face as an entertainment. He would physically shove her. He would, in the context of flashback jokes, reveal that he and Lois had attempted to abandon her at a fire station when she was still an infant. The joke was that her own parents had tried to throw her away before she could walk. The show presented this as comedy and expected the audience to receive it as such. The difficulty in writing about what happened to Meg is that it requires engaging with the question of what the show was actually communicating, even if not entirely intentionally. The sustained, escalating, never-resolved treatment of Meg across those roughly 10 seasons carried a message, however unconsciously transmitted. The message was that certain people simply invite contempt, that some people exist primarily as targets, that the correct response to someone's pain, if you have been assigned the social role of the person everyone mistreats, is to quietly accept that role because any attempt to change it will only make things worse for everyone. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode from Season 10, mentioned earlier, made this message explicit in a way that enraged a large portion of the audience. Meg's speech to her family, her clear-eyed, accurate accounting of the specific ways each of them had failed her, and everyone around them was the kind of cathartic moment that a decade of Meg abuse had made feel genuinely earned. Audiences had been waiting for it. And then the episode's resolution revealed that Meg's role in the family was to be the person who absorbs all of the displaced aggression and self-loathing that the other Griffins cannot direct at themselves or at each other. Without Meg as the designated target, the family turns on itself. And Meg, understanding this, takes her suffering back. She accepts it. The episode ends with the status quo restored, and the moral of the story being that Meg's pain serves a necessary function, and she should stop complaining about it. Mila Kunis has described the experience of voicing Meg with consistent professionalism and warmth. She has noted publicly that playing a character who is the subject of so much mockery created real-world experiences, including strangers using the dismissive line Peter directed at Meg as a way of dismissing Kunis herself. The fictional cruelty had developed a real-world echo. The people who watched the show had absorbed the show's attitude toward Meg, and sometimes deployed that attitude toward the real woman who gave Meg her voice. What makes the whole situation especially frustrating is the proof, scattered across the show's run, that the writers knew how to write Meg well. The Simpsons crossover episode in season 13 gave Meg a genuine friendship with Lisa Simpson, including a storyline where Lisa recognizes that Meg is talented, that her sense of alienation is not a reflection of her actual worth, that she has something real to contribute to the world. It was a well-written, warm, character-respecting episode. And it confirmed that the capacity to treat Meg as a real person was there in the writer's room. The capacity was always there. The commitment to exercising it consistently was not. The abuse did pull back eventually, starting around season 14 and becoming significantly reduced by season 22. More women on the writing staff pushed back against it, and the results were visible. Meg became more competent, more capable of fighting back against the people who mistreated her, more willing to assert herself. By the later seasons, she was getting storylines that treated her as an actual character rather than as a premise. The recovery was real. But the damage of those 10-odd seasons was already woven into the fabric of the show and into the culture around it. Meg Griffin had become, in the popular imagination, the character you treat badly, a meme, a shorthand for a particular kind of invisible, dismissible person. And that transformation was almost entirely the result of writers' room choices that had nothing to do with who Meg had originally been, and everything to do with what the show had decided she was convenient to be. Meg Griffin deserved better. That statement does not need qualification or nuance. She was an ordinary teenager in the first season of this show, and ordinary teenagers deserving to be treated with decency is not a complicated position. What the show did to her over 10-plus seasons was not clever or subversive or darkly funny. It was protracted and mean-spirited, and the audience's eventual fatigue with it was a healthier response than their initial acceptance of it. Part 8. Chris, Quagmire, Joe, Cleveland, the world beyond the Griffin front door. While Peter, Lois, Brian, Stewie, and Meg occupied the emotional center of Family Guy, the show built an entire world of secondary and recurring characters around them that was just as carefully conceived and, in some cases, just as dramatically affected by the show's long evolution. Understanding this larger world is essential to understanding the show fully, because the relationships between the Griffin family and the community of Spooner Street reveal things about each character that the domestic scenes alone cannot. Chris Griffin is the simplest character in the immediate family and is, for that very reason, often the most endearing. Voiced by Seth Green, who has said the character's voice came partly from his impression of a specific type of cheerfully confused young man, Chris is a large, good-natured, not particularly bright teenager who sees the world with a benevolence that is completely impervious to evidence. He is, in many ways, a younger version of his father, and the show used that parallel in the early seasons with genuine affection rather than contempt. Where Peter's obliviousness caused damage, Chris's obliviousness caused harmlessness. He stumbled through situations without quite understanding them, and came out the other side with his essential goodness intact. Chris had a recurring gag in the early seasons involving an evil monkey that lived in his closet and would point at him menacingly whenever the closet door was opened. The evil monkey sounds like a throwaway joke, and in one sense it is, but it also worked as a piece of character psychology if you wanted to read it that way. Chris was the family member who saw something menacing in his private space that nobody else acknowledged or helped him with. The evil monkey was his secret terror, and the joke was that nobody took it seriously. In a later season, the monkey was given an explanation he had been traumatized by his wife's infidelity and had become depressed and hostile, and eventually his storyline was resolved. It is a small thing, but it represents a moment where the show treated a character element that had been purely comedic with some genuine emotional weight. What is most notable about Chris across the show's entire run is how relatively unchanged he remained compared to the rest of his family. He got into ridiculous situations. He had relationships that went sideways in predictably Chris-shaped ways. He occasionally showed flashes of something deeper sensitivity, artistic feeling, that were never developed as thoroughly as they could have been. But he never became cruel. He never became a version of himself that was fundamentally opposed to what he had originally been. In a show full of characters who were slowly hollowed out and refilled with something worse, Chris Griffin's consistent good-naturedness is something worth acknowledging. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most complicated supporting characters in the show's entire history, and the complication is not accidental. He was designed as a deliberate exaggeration of a particular masculine archetype, the womanizer, the bachelor who has turned sexual pursuit into a kind of lifestyle philosophy, the guy who can read a room for opportunity with a speed and accuracy that would be impressive applied to literally anything else. His catchphrase, which this channel does not use in our own voice, has become one of the most recognizable expressions in the entire vocabulary of adult animated television. In the early seasons, Quagmire was played entirely for comedy. His behavior was so extreme that it existed in a clearly cartoon space, not endorsement, not even really comment, just pure outrageous absurdism in human form. He was Quagmire. He did Quagmire things. The show had no more intention of examining the implications of his behavior than a Bugs Bunny cartoon intended to examine the physics of cliff edges. He was a type character, a specific exaggeration, funny in the way that the most extreme versions of familiar types can be funny when the exaggeration is clear enough that it reads as satire rather than celebration. As the show went on, Quagmire's role became more complex in ways that reflected some real tension in the writer's room about what the character was supposed to be. In the episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, Quagmire is given a dramatic storyline involving his sister Brenda's abusive relationship. He becomes, in this episode, a genuine hero, someone who recognizes a dangerous situation, tries to address it through legitimate means, and ultimately takes more extreme action when those means fail. It is a jarring tonal shift from his usual comedic presentation, but it works, partly because the character has enough established history that an episode positioning him as someone with real moral instincts is not entirely implausible. His feud with Brian in the later seasons was built on an interesting paradox. Quagmire is demonstrably worse than Brian in most measurable ways, and yet his speech cataloging Brian's failures was accurate. The feud between them revealed something about the show's own uncertainty about who its characters were supposed to be. Quagmire criticizing Brian for things that Quagmire himself had done in less confrontational ways, while Brian responded to each criticism with increasing pettiness rather than reflection. Neither character came out of their ongoing conflict looking good, and that was probably the point, though it sometimes felt like the point was less about character insight and more about finding a consistent antagonistic dynamic to fill screen time. Joe Swanson's arc over the show's run is a quiet tragedy in miniature. Patrick Warburton's voice performance has always been one of the show's most consistent pleasures. There is something inherently funny about that specific baritone delivering phrases like, "Bring it on," with absolute conviction and context that escalate from the mundane to the catastrophic. But what happened to Joe's character over the seasons undercut the dignity that had originally defined him. When Joe was introduced in A Hero Sits Next Door from Season 1, he was precisely that, a hero. He was the paraplegic cop who had been injured in the line of duty and who continued, from his wheelchair, to be one of the most capable and respected figures in the community. Peter's jealousy of Joe in that episode was the joke, but Joe himself was not. He was genuinely impressive. He had the kind of matter-of-fact courage that makes heroism look like the most natural thing in the world, and his disability was presented as simply a fact about him rather than as either a source of inspiration narrative or a target for mockery. Over the seasons, the show's treatment of Joe became steadily less respectful. His disability, which had originally been a character detail rather than a comedic premise, became a recurring target for the kind of humor that the early show would have avoided. His marriage to Bonnie, initially a warm and functional partnership, underwent difficulties that were played partly as comedy. His friendships with Peter and the others became more fraught. The confident, capable police officer who had impressed an entire neighborhood became a figure who was, increasingly, the subject of the same casual disrespect that characterized the show's later treatment of most of its recurring characters. Cleveland Brown, the soft-spoken African-American neighbor who was originally one of Peter's closest friends, left the main show for its spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons, from 2009 to 2013 on Fox. His return to Family Guy after the spin-off's cancellation was handled with some self-awareness. The show acknowledged, in jokes, that he had simply walked back in. Cleveland's character across his time on both shows demonstrated something important. He had consistent warmth and a consistent sense of decency that made him one of the more grounded characters in the entire extended Family Guy universe. When he was present, he tended to have a moderating effect on the group's energy, which was part of why his absence was felt during the years the spin-off occupied. The world of Spooner Street and the Drunken Clam and James Woods Regional High School was built with genuine care in the early seasons. Every supporting character had a function and a place. Mayor Adam West played with magnificent self-aware absurdity. By the late Adam West was one of television's great running jokes. A man in a position of civic authority who applied the logic of his most famous fictional role to every conceivable real-world situation. The recurring antagonist Connie D'Amico, Meg's high school nemesis, was the most recognizable type. The popular girl whose cruelty was a mask for her own insecurity, deployed effectively as a foil for Meg's situation. Mort Goldman, the nervous pharmacist. Dr. Hartman, the incompetent physician. Herbert, the elderly neighbor, whose affection for Chris was played as dark comedy in ways that the show handled with varying degrees of elegance. These characters collectively made up the texture of a world. They were not just set dressing. They were the specific community that the Griffin family existed within, and the specificity of that community was part of what made the early show feel grounded despite all its absurdity. You could imagine Spooner Street as a real place, a slightly heightened version of a real American neighborhood, in a way that became harder as the seasons went on and the world around the Griffins became increasingly abstract. Part 9. The dark psychology beneath every character. There is something worth sitting with for a moment here, in the middle of all this character analysis, and it requires stepping back from the individual trees to look at the shape of the forest. When you map out what happened to every major character in Family Guy across its run, the specific directions they moved in, the specific qualities they gained and lost, the patterns in how the transformations unfolded, a picture emerges that is more interesting than a simple story of creative decline. The Griffins, taken as a group, moved toward cruelty, not by accident or through narrative necessity, but as a consistent creative direction that the show pursued across many seasons. Peter became cruel, Lois became cold, Brian became selfish and deceptive. Stewie's malevolence was softened but redirected into other, more personal forms of manipulation. Meg's victimhood was weaponized. Even Chris, who remained largely uncorrupted, had his sweeter qualities pushed into the background in favor of jokes about his obliviousness that occasionally tipped into cruelty toward others. This collective movement tells you something. It tells you that the writer's room, over the years, developed a relationship with cruelty as a default comedic mode. When in doubt, the instinct became to punch something or someone. When a scene needed energy, the default was to have someone be mean to someone else. The specific targets rotated. Sometimes it was Meg, sometimes it was Brian, sometimes it was Joe Swanson, sometimes it was a random stranger, but the energy was consistent. Cruelty had become the show's primary register. This is not the same as saying the show lacked intelligence or craft. The later seasons of Family Guy continued to produce individually brilliant episodes and moments alongside the mean-spirited ones. The writing was not uniformly bad, but it was oriented toward a specific emotional mode that the original show had not been oriented toward. The early show's emotional default was warmth. A chaotic, messy, occasionally sharp-elbowed warmth, but warmth nonetheless. The later show's emotional default was something harder. The psychology behind this shift is speculative, but some patterns are worth naming. One is the pressure of maintaining freshness across an enormous number of episodes. Family Guy has produced well over 400 episodes at this point. Generating 400 episodes of genuinely warm, character-driven family comedy is extraordinarily difficult. Generating 400 episodes of shock and cruelty comedy is somewhat easier because the formula is simpler. You pick a target, you escalate toward it, you end without consequence. You reset for the following week. Another pattern worth noting is what happened to accountability in the show's universe. The early seasons operated on a rough moral economy where characters faced at least some consequence for their worst behavior. Peter would feel genuine remorse. Brian would reckon with his failures. Even Stewie, for all his theatrical menace, existed in a world where his schemes reliably failed, which was its own form of consequence. As the show progressed, accountability became increasingly optional. Characters did things that should have had significant consequences and faced none. Peter committed acts that in any morally coherent world would have ended relationships and changed dynamics, and the next episode began as though nothing had happened. This is not just a writing shortcut, though it is that. It is also a statement about the world the show chose to depict. A world without accountability is a world where power matters more than goodness, where the capacity to cause harm carries no cost, where the experience of being harmed is simply something that happens to certain characters and is then forgotten. Meg Griffin lived in that world for over a decade of television. The audience was given her perspective often enough to understand what it felt like, and then consistently denied any resolution of that feeling. There is also something interesting in the show's relationship with intelligence over its run. The early show valued intelligence not as a virtue in itself, but as a quality that produced good comedy when combined with the right character. Brian's intelligence made him funny. Stewie's intelligence made him extraordinary. Lois's intelligence made her the indispensable center of the household. Even Peter's lack of intelligence was written with intelligence, the specific texture of his misunderstandings, the precise quality of his misreadings of situations, was carefully crafted to be funny rather than just random. As the show went on, intelligence became less valued as a character quality. Brian's intelligence was hollow. Stewie's intelligence was redirected toward emotional stories rather than the specific, inventive, technical genius of his early seasons. Peter's lack of intelligence stopped being characterized and started being deployed indiscriminately. The show became, gradually, less interested in thinking about its characters and more interested in using them as delivery mechanisms for jokes that did not require the audience to think much either. This is the dark truth that all the character analysis eventually leads to. Family Guy, at its core, is a show about a family and families in human psychology carry enormous weight as metaphors for everything from personal identity to social structure to the transmission of trauma across generations. The early show understood this instinctively. It built a family that was specific and funny and recognizable, and it used that family to tell stories that, underneath all the absurdity, connected to real things. The Griffin household was a place where love and chaos coexisted, where people failed each other and also came back and tried again. The later show retained the family's surface structure but hollowed out the love. What remained was chaos without the return, failure without the try again. And that shift from a story about a family who loved each other badly to a story about a family who no longer seemed to much care for each other at all is what most viewers are actually responding to when they say the show got worse. They are responding to the loss of something that had mattered to them, the loss of the particular warmth of that specific fictional household. The loss of the feeling, however irrational it might be to feel it about a cartoon, that the Griffins were real people whose lives had some kind of meaning. Part 10. The cancellation, the comeback, and the writing room that changed. To understand what happened to the characters of Family Guy, you have to understand the structural disruptions the show went through in its early years. The cancellations and the comeback are not just interesting television history, they are the hidden cause of much of what later went wrong. When Family Guy was canceled in 2002, the writing staff did not wait around. They had rent to pay and careers to manage. Writers moved on to other projects, other shows, other opportunities. Some stayed in the MacFarlane orbit, a few would eventually work on American Dad, which launched in 2005. But the group that had built the first 3 seasons together did not reassemble in the same configuration when the show came back. MacFarlane has spoken directly about this. He acknowledged in interviews that one of the persistent effects of Family Guy's rocky early history was the constant need to bring in new writers. Every time the show was pulled off the air and then brought back, the writing room had to be restaffed, at least partially. New writers are not inherently a problem. Fresh perspectives can bring fresh energy, but they do carry different sensibilities into the room. They have different instincts about what is funny, different thresholds for what constitutes going too far, different ideas about what the characters fundamentally are. The writing room for seasons 1 through 3 had a specific shared understanding of the Griffin family that came from having built them together under MacFarlane's close supervision. That shared understanding was the invisible architecture that held the show's tone consistent even across 22 episodes per season. When that room scattered and was rebuilt with new people, the shared understanding had to be rebuilt too, and in the process, some things shifted. Small calibrations changed. The angle of the show adjusted by a few degrees. And a few degrees, maintained across many seasons, produces a very different destination than the original heading. MacFarlane himself began stepping back from the day-to-day creative work of Family Guy around 2011. He did not leave entirely. He continued to voice Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire for every episode, spending time in the recording booth. But the writing, the story decisions, the creative oversight that he had once exercised in the manner of a showrunner who was also the creator of the world was handed to other people. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin became the showrunning team responsible for the day-to-day management of the show, while MacFarlane concentrated his considerable energy on a growing list of other projects. The other projects were substantial. The 2012 film Ted, which MacFarlane wrote, directed, and starred in, earned over $500 million worldwide. He followed it with A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014 and Ted 2 in 2015. He created and starred in the science fiction series The Orville, which premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu. He pursued a parallel career as a singer of big band and jazz standards. He signed a deal with NBC Universal reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years. He was, by any measure, one of the busiest people in Hollywood, and Family Guy was one item on a very long list. The impact of his reduced involvement on the show is something that is easier to see in retrospect than it was in the moment. MacFarlane understood the Griffin family in a specific way that came from having created them. He knew the precise temperature at which their humor operated best. He knew when something had gone too far, and his instinct about that threshold had been calibrated by years of building the show from nothing. Without that calibration active in the writer's room, the show was free to push in directions he might not have endorsed. The showrunners who replaced MacFarlane in the creative seat were not incompetent. Appel and Sulkin were experienced professionals who had been working on Family Guy for years and knew the characters and the world well. But there is a difference between knowing a show and having the specific creative authority that comes from having built it. A showrunner working on someone else's creation makes different choices than the creator themselves. They may be more willing to push boundaries because they are less invested in what made the original work. They may be less able to recognize when a character has moved too far from their core because they did not define that core. The 2007 Writers Guild of America strike added another layer of disruption. MacFarlane was a vocal supporter of the writers and joined the picket lines. Fox, during the strike, aired 3 episodes of Family Guy that had already been completed, doing so without MacFarlane's approval. The relationship between MacFarlane and the network, never entirely comfortable, became more strained. He had publicly expressed discomfort with Fox's broader corporate identity, particularly its association with Fox News. In 2021, he posted on social media that the commentary on Fox News had him wishing Family Guy was on any other network, comparing the situation to a failing marriage. The 2023 WGA strike provided another disruption, with MacFarlane joining the picket lines again alongside the show's writing staff. Another interruption to production. Another break in the creative rhythm. The show had now lived through multiple significant disruptions to its creative ecosystem, each one leaving a slight residue that added to the accumulated distance from the original vision. What is most interesting about all of this is what it reveals about the show's identity problem. Family Guy existed, in its post-MacFarlane years, as a brand that had outlasted the specific creative conditions that had produced it. The characters had the same names and the same designs and the same voice actors, but the creative environment that had shaped them, the specific intelligence and sensibility and warmth of the original writer's room, with its creator deeply engaged and its tone carefully maintained, had changed profoundly. What continued was the franchise, the intellectual property, the television show as business entity. What sometimes struggled was the television show as creative work. The 2025 announcement of a multi-season renewal deal with Disney extending Family Guy through season 27, and the 2028 to 29 television season confirmed what the ratings trajectory had already suggested. The show was continuing for business reasons rather than creative ones. The economics of animated television are such that even an animated series with a fraction of its original viewership generates significant revenue through syndication, streaming, merchandise, and licensing. Family Guy at 700,000 viewers is still profitable in ways that most live-action shows at 700,000 viewers would not be. The business case for continuation remained strong, even as the creative case became harder to make. MacFarlane, in a 2024 interview, described the show's continuation in terms of financial utility. It made people happy and helped fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation organizations like Rainforest Trust. It was a reasonable position for a person who had been working on the same project for 25-plus years to take, but it was also notably different from the enthusiasm of a creator who had a vision they wanted to share. Part 11. What these characters left behind: legacy, impact, and the permanent marks. Whatever the later seasons became, the first several seasons of Family Guy changed television. They changed what was permissible in animated comedy. They changed how audiences understood the animated format. They introduced storytelling techniques, the sustained cutaway gag, most obviously, that were immediately imitated and that reshaped the grammar of adult animation. And the characters themselves became part of the cultural landscape in ways that extended far beyond any individual episode or season. Peter Griffin's face is one of the most recognizable images in 21st century pop culture. He appeared as a Battle Pass skin in the first season of the 5th chapter of Fortnite in December 2023. There are Peter Griffin costumes, Peter Griffin phone cases, Peter Griffin lawn ornaments. His various exclamations and catchphrases have entered the vocabulary of people who have never watched a complete episode of the show. The character has a cross-cultural reach that few animated figures achieve. But it is interesting to note which version of Peter Griffin the culture has latched onto. When you see a Peter Griffin Halloween costume, when you hear someone do a Peter Griffin impression, when you see Peter Griffin merch in a shop window, the version of Peter being invoked is almost universally the early one. The warm, bumbling, good-hearted idiot who loved his wife and his beer and his terrible ideas, not the crueler version that emerged in the middle and later seasons. The culture kept the Peter it had fallen in love with and quietly set aside the Peter that the writers eventually built in his place. That selective memory is itself a form of verdict. Stewie Griffin's cultural legacy is similarly tied to the early version of the character. The evil genius baby is what people mean when they reference Stewie. The ray guns, the British accent, the matricidal plots, the theatrical monologues. This is the Stewie who ended up on merchandise, in Halloween costumes, in cultural memory. The gentler, more emotionally complex Stewie of later seasons is appreciated by fans who followed the show closely across all its years. But the Stewie who entered the culture at large is the Season 1 Stewie, the one who was unlike anything else on television, and who announced himself with such clarity that you could not mistake what he was. The March 2026 announcement of a Stewie spin-off series, ordered for 2 seasons by Fox and set to premiere during the 2027-28 television season, is an acknowledgement of how durable the character remains as a franchise anchor. The spin-off will presumably center on the version of Stewie who exists in the current show, the more emotionally complex, post-evil genius version. But the commercial case for the spin-off rests substantially on the cultural capital built by the original conception. People will tune in because of what Stewie was. What the spin-off does with who he has become will be its own separate question. Brian Griffin's cultural legacy is more complicated, partly because of how dramatically the character changed over the show's run. In the early seasons, Brian was beloved in a specific way that felt personal. He was the character people projected themselves onto, the one who felt most like someone you might actually know. His decline in the later seasons was taken personally by a significant portion of the audience in a way that Stewie's or Peter's changes were not, precisely because Brian had been the point of identification. When someone you have identified with turns into someone you do not recognize, the feeling is closer to loss than disappointment. There is an entire community of viewers who maintain what you might call a mental partition around Brian, who continue to relate to the early Brian while regarding the later Brian as a separate entity who happens to share the same name and visual design. This is not a rational response to a fictional character, but then again, very few genuinely felt responses to fiction are rational, which is what makes fiction worth making in the first place. Meg Griffin's cultural legacy is perhaps the most instructive of all. She became, over the years, one of the most recognizable symbols of social rejection in all of animated television. The Meg meme, the idea of Meg as the person everyone mistreats, the one who is permanently at the bottom of the social hierarchy, spread far beyond the show itself. People who had never watched a complete episode of Family Guy knew what it meant to be a Meg. The character's suffering had been so sustained and so specific that it became a category. What is interesting about this is that the culture absorbed the Meg meme without necessarily absorbing the critique of it. People use the idea of Meg to describe social exclusion, but they did not always use it critically. Sometimes they used it approvingly, as though the Meg position was simply a natural consequence of certain qualities, rather than a social construction imposed by the people around her. The show, by failing to consistently critique its own treatment of Meg even while depicting it, made the meme available for uses it probably did not intend. Mila Kunis has given Meg her voice for well over 2 decades at this point, making her one of the most tenured voice actors in the history of animated television. She has brought consistent intelligence and commitment to a role that gave her increasingly little to work with across the middle years of the show. In the later seasons, as Meg has been treated more like a full character, the depth of what Kunis can do with the voice has had more room to emerge. It is one of the small pleasures of the show's recent evolution. The show's impact on animated comedy more broadly cannot be overstated. The specific style of Family Guy, the non-sequitur cutaway, the pop culture reference as comedic unit, the animation style that prioritized expressiveness over visual complexity was copied so thoroughly and so quickly that it is hard now to see it clearly as innovation. Everything from the various McFarlane spin-offs to shows that were directly inspired by Family Guy's approach absorbed elements of the original formula. Some did it well, many did it badly. The cutaway gag in particular was adopted so widely, and often so ineptly, that the format itself became associated with a certain kind of lazy animated comedy, exactly the kind that Family Guy's own later seasons exemplified. The show also, in its first few seasons, expanded what was permissible on broadcast television in terms of content. Family Guy pushed past lines that had previously been treated as firm, and it did so not by being crudely transgressive, but by being genuinely funny about difficult things. The earliest complaints from the Parents Television Council and the letters to the FCC were, in retrospect, partly a response to the show's actual provocations, but also partly a generational discomfort with animated comedy that operated in registers previously reserved for live-action adult programming. The show normalized a broader vocabulary for animation, and that normalization had lasting effects on what animators and writers could do in subsequent years. Part 12. Sleeping with the Ghosts of Griffin's Past. Late at night, when you have been sitting with these characters long enough, something quiet happens. The analysis fades a little and the feeling moves to the front. And the feeling is something like grief, mixed with something like gratitude, mixed with the particular tenderness that attaches itself to things that have meant something to you over a long period of time. The Griffin family, in their purest form, was a very specific thing. A heavy-set man who loved his wife and his beer and managed, despite his extraordinary capacity for disaster, to hold a household together and keep coming back to the people who needed him. A woman who had chosen an improbable life and loved it stubbornly, even when it wore her down. A teenage girl who just wanted to be seen. A teenage boy who saw the world with the open, unguarded attention of someone who had not yet learned to be cynical about it. A baby genius with a secret world running underneath his ordinary life, building impossible things in his crib, keeping his enormous inner existence hidden from the people who changed his diapers. And a dog. A dog who read novels and drank martinis and sat at the bar with his best friend, and had an unfounded hope that things would eventually work out the way he wanted them to. These were genuinely good characters. Not morally good, necessarily most of them had substantial flaws, but good in the sense that fiction uses the word. They were particular. They were specific. They had interior lives that the show, at its best, invited you into. And the fact that they were cartoon characters in a broad animated comedy did not make them any less real in the ways that mattered. Fiction creates real attachment. The characters we love in stories become real to us in the ways that matter for how we feel about them. And the Griffins, at their best, inspired real affection. The dark truth that the title of this video promises is not a single revelation. It is a slow accumulation. The dark truth is that the characters you loved in the early seasons of Family Guy were slowly, consistently, and often deliberately changed into versions of themselves that had lost the qualities you loved. And they were changed for reasons that had less to do with storytelling and more to do with the economics of keeping a show in production across many decades. The darkness is in the gap between what the show was and what it chose to become, and that gap is made darker by the fact that it was not inevitable. Other choices were available. The show sometimes made them, in individual episodes that reminded you what Family Guy had once been and could occasionally still be. But let us end somewhere quieter than that, because this is the hour of night for quiet things. Think about the first episode you ever saw of Family Guy. Wherever you came to it, whether you watched the Super Bowl premiere as a kid in 1999, or you discovered it on Adult Swim in 2003 at midnight with the volume turned low, or you found it on DVD, or streaming at whatever year you were the right age for it, think about how it landed. The specific texture of that first encounter with Peter Griffin's particular kind of wrong-headed warmth. The delight of Stewie's first villain monologue. The way Brian's dryness cut through all of it like light through a slightly open door. Those characters you met in that first encounter were built with genuine care by a young man who had been thinking about them since his days at art school, who had refined them from early sketches into something that felt irreplaceable. Seth MacFarlane, whatever came later, made something in those first 3 seasons that millions of people loved in the specific way you only love things that show you something about yourself. The Griffin family, at their best, held up a funny, exaggerated, warmly lit mirror to the chaos and affection and relentless impracticality of family life in America. And people recognized themselves in the reflection. That recognition is what the later seasons eroded. The mirror gradually stopped reflecting warmth and started reflecting something colder and sharper and less comfortable. The show that had once made you feel seen, made you feel increasingly observed rather than recognized. The distance between viewer and characters grew. The family that had once felt like people you knew became people you watched from a further remove, less invested, less moved, more likely to change the channel. And yet, the early episodes still exist. Season 1 still plays the way it played in 1999. Peter and Lois still make up at the end of those episodes. Brian still sits in the kitchen with a drink and says the precisely correct dry thing at the precisely correct moment. Stewie still builds his weapons and delivers his monologues and is defeated by the simple indignity of being 1 year old in a world that will not take him seriously. Meg still sits in the corner of the frame and wants something simple that her family cannot seem to see. They are all still there, in those early episodes, being exactly what they were designed to be. The dark truths that came later were layered on top of them, season by season, choice by choice. But they could not erase what was underneath. The original characters are still present in the archive, still specific, still particular, still capable of producing the exact emotional notes they were built to produce. There is something almost comforting in that, if you let yourself feel it. The show changed. The characters were altered. Some of what made them great was lost, sometimes irretrievably. But the record of what they originally were remains. And the record is enough to understand what a genuinely remarkable thing was created. One early January night in 1999, when a young animator's 7-minute pitch became a television show that 22 million people watched immediately following a Super Bowl. The Griffin family, in their first 3 seasons, was one of the best ensembles in the history of animated comedy. That statement can coexist with the fact that their later seasons represented significant creative decline. Both things are true at once. Both things deserve to be acknowledged. The dark truth is the decline. The light underneath it is how good the beginning was. And that is, as always with the things we love, where it gets complicated. If you made it through this entire journey tonight and you are still awake, or if you drifted off somewhere in the middle and you are just coming back now, thank you for being here. This kind of deep, careful look at things we love is exactly what this space is for. If this video gave you something to think about, hit the like button. And if you want more nights like this one, deep and slow and full of the kind of detail that earns its length, subscribing is the thing that keeps it coming. There are more stories to tell, more characters to understand, more dark truths to sit with in the comfortable dark. Take care of yourself out there, wherever you are watching from, and whatever time it is on your clock. Sleep well, end of script. Expanded section, the world inside the cutaway, what the gags actually told us. Before we close out fully, there is one dimension of the show's character storytelling that deserves its own extended treatment because it is the dimension that most people talk about when they talk about Family Guy, and yet the one most frequently misunderstood. The cutaway gag is not just a comedic technique. In the early seasons especially, cutaways were a form of character revelation that operated entirely outside the main plot of any given episode. They were the show's way of giving you additional information about who a character was without the episode having to stop and explain it. When Peter says, "This is worse than the time I," and the show cuts to a completely unrelated scene, the conventional critical reading is that this is random, that the gag has nothing to do with anything and exists purely as a non sequitur joke. But if you pay attention to which character initiates a cutaway and what kind of scene the cutaway depicts, you start to notice patterns. Early Peter's cutaways tend to involve things that are physically absurd, being in situations that are improbable but not cruel, causing disasters through miscalculation rather than malice. Early Brian's cutaways, when Brian is the reference point, tend to be about failed romanticism or intellectual aspiration falling short of itself. Stewie's cutaway flashbacks tend to involve the world not taking him seriously in ways he finds specifically infuriating. These are not accidents. The early writers used the cutaway format as a kind of shorthand character biography, a way of populating the characters' pasts with specific, funny, tonally appropriate incidents that reinforced who each person fundamentally was. When you hear a Peter cutaway, even in the early seasons, you are hearing the show tell you something true about Peter's interior life and history. The randomness is a surface quality. Underneath it is craft. What happened to the cutaways as the show progressed mirrors exactly what happened to the characters. They became untethered from character. The connection between the person making the reference and the content of the resulting scene became looser and looser until it effectively disappeared. Later season cutaways could be triggered by any character and would produce any result because the writers had stopped thinking of them as character moments and started thinking of them as joke slots to be filled with whatever was on their minds that week. The Conway Twitty gag, which appeared multiple times across several seasons and consisted entirely of the show cutting to a complete, unedited performance of a Conway Twitty song, was the most honest possible statement about where this had ended up. There was no character reference. There was no punchline. There was no connection to anything that had happened in the episode. There was just a song playing while the audience sat there, and the show basically communicated that it did not feel the need to entertain them at that moment. Some viewers found this funny in a very specific register, the comedy of pure endurance, of being made to sit through something that was genuinely failing to be a joke. Most viewers found it frustrating. The South Park response to this was the Cartoon Wars two-parter from 2006, in which the show's creators directly and explicitly argued that Family Guy's cutaway jokes were produced by manatees pushing idea balls together randomly, that is, that they required no actual creative intelligence, only the application of a formula. The criticism landed, and it landed because by 2006 there was already enough evidence to support it. The cutaways of the revival era were frequently less connected to anything, less specifically chosen for any character, and less likely to illuminate or deepen the world of the show than the cutaways of the first 3 seasons had been. What the cutaway problem reveals, when you look at it through the lens of character, is that a show's relationship with its own comedic techniques is also a relationship with its characters. The cutaway was originally a character tool. It became a production tool, and in becoming a production tool, a way to fill 22 minutes with enough content to broadcast, it lost the function that had made it genuinely creative in the first place. Expanded section, the music of the show, what the songs said about the characters. Family Guy has always been a musical show. This is sometimes overlooked in discussions of the series, which tend to focus on the cutaway gags and the character dynamics and the humor. But music has been a consistent and important part of how the show communicated, and the original songs written for the show tell you things about the characters that the dialogue and the plot sometimes do not. Seth MacFarlane is a genuinely accomplished singer and musical arranger, and his facility with music has been present in Family Guy from its first season. The show would occasionally break into musical numbers, sometimes within a cutaway, sometimes as part of the main episode narrative, and these numbers were frequently some of the clearest expressions of character in the entire run. When Peter sings in the early seasons, the songs tend to express things about his emotional life that his ordinary dialogue cannot reach. His singing voice in the show is deliberately and specifically the voice of a man who is not technically skilled, but who is absolutely sincere. And there is something deeply right about that quality for the character. Peter's music, when it appeared, felt like his truest self breaking through the surface. Stewie's musical moments in the early seasons were similarly character-specific. They tended toward the theatrical and the grandiose, the same register as his spoken, villainous monologues, but elevated by melody. When Stewie broke into song, he was at his most unguarded, his most genuinely himself, in a way that the elaborate scheming and posturing sometimes obscured. There is a particular vulnerability in singing that makes even the most theatrical performer briefly visible as a person underneath the performance. Brian's musical moments were usually wry and self-aware, the voice of someone who knows enough about music to know what he is doing, but who also knows at some level that knowing is not the same as being. Brian at the piano, in the early seasons, was a character confronting his own gap between aspiration and achievement in real time, and the music was the medium through which that gap became legible. The most famous musical moment in the show's history, one of the most famous in the history of animated television, is Peter's elaborate choreographed song in the Season 3 episode, I Am Peter. Hear me roar? But honestly, the musical high watermark of the show's first run is a quiet one. In Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows from Season 2, Brian falls for a woman named Pearl who is a shut-in, isolated and bitter after years of being ignored by the world. The episode builds to Brian singing to Pearl in a moment that is genuinely tender, that reaches for something that most animated comedies would never bother reaching for. It is a moment of real grace in a show full of loud, swinging humor, and it works because Brian, at that point in the show's run, was still a character capable of grace. His care for Pearl was believable because his capacity for care was established and real. The show's later musical numbers became more theatrical and less emotionally specific. They were better produced, often the arrangements got more elaborate, the performances more polished, but they were less connected to any particular character's interior life. They were spectacle rather than revelation, beautiful sometimes, occasionally very funny, but missing the quality that had made the early musical moments so unexpectedly affecting. Expanded section. The recurring characters and what they revealed. Herbert, the elderly neighbor who had an unsettling fixation on Chris, was a character who walked a line that few animated shows would have attempted. The discomfort he produced was intentional, and it was built into the character's design from the beginning. He moved slowly. He spoke softly. He offered Chris things, lemonade, yard work, attention in ways that carried an undercurrent of menace that was never quite made explicit enough to require direct confrontation but was always present. The show played this primarily for the specific kind of comedy that comes from dramatic irony, the audience understanding something that Chris, in his good-natured obliviousness, did not. What is interesting about Herbert from a character perspective is that the show occasionally complicated him in ways that made him more than just a one-note discomfort generator. There are episodes in which Herbert's military past is explored. He served in World War II, apparently, and in which his essential loneliness is made explicit. He is not only what his most disturbing quality suggests. He is also an old man who is isolated and who has a dog named Jesse who loves him and whom he loves in return. The show never let these complications resolve Herbert into a comfortable figure. The unsettling quality remained, but the complications gave him more texture than the premise alone would have provided. Mayor Adam West, played by the late Adam West with what can only be described as majestic self-awareness, was one of the show's most consistent pleasures across its entire run. West knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing a version of himself, playing a character, and the awareness was threaded through every line he delivered. His willingness to engage with the absurdist comedy the show built around him, the surreal policies, the bizarre personal habits, The complete detachment from any recognizable logic of civic governance gave the character a warmth and humor that would not have worked with anyone else in the role. When Adam West died in June 2017, the show honored him in an episode titled Adam West High School, in which the town renamed its high school after the mayor, and the characters reflected on what he had meant to them. The episode was genuinely moving in the specific way that the death of a beloved recurring character can move you, even in a comedy context, not because the character's death is itself tragic in a conventional sense, but because the space he leaves behind is suddenly, specifically, exactly his shape, and nothing else will ever fit into it quite right. Ernie the Giant Chicken, the character who periodically engages Peter in those epic, city-destroying battle sequences, is worth examining as a character in himself rather than just as a recurring gag device. The fights between Peter and Ernie began in Season 2's episode Da Boom as the result of a coupon dispute, a genuinely absurd premise delivered deadpan and recurred across multiple seasons, each iteration expanding in scale and duration and physical destruction. What makes these sequences work is not the violence itself, but the complete commitment to the premise. Both Peter and Ernie are fully engaged in their conflict. There is no winking at the camera. The fight is real to them, even as it becomes progressively more disconnected from any physical laws that might constrain it. The chicken fights are one of the purest expressions of Family Guy's early animated sensibility. The idea that animation allows you to extend a premise to whatever extreme it demands, without the limits imposed by live-action physics or budget or plausibility. The show was at its best when it embraced those possibilities fully, when it used the unlimited space of animation to go places that only animation could go. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl who served as Meg's primary high school antagonist, was more carefully written in the early seasons than her function as a villain type might suggest. She was not simply mean. She was strategic about her meanness in ways that pointed toward a real interior life, a person who had constructed her social position carefully and who defended it with the instincts of someone who understood, at some level, that the position was fragile. Later seasons pushed her further into pure antagonist territory, which was a flattening, but the early characterization had enough specificity to make her feel real. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family's perpetually incompetent physician, served a specific function in the show's universe. He was the show's comment on institutional authority, the person whose social position implies competence that his actual performance consistently fails to support. He appeared in episodes across many seasons, and while his incompetence was always the joke, the show occasionally found ways to use him for something beyond the single note. He was also simply very funny in the deadpan, catastrophically confident way that the show could do extremely well when it committed to a comedic type. Tom Tucker, the pompous news anchor voiced by McFarlane, existed primarily as a vehicle for the show's commentary on television news as a format. His complete detachment from the human implications of the stories he was reporting, the way he would pivot from a story about mass casualties to the weather forecast with the same professionally modulated tone, was a satirical observation about broadcast journalism that the show delivered, consistently and often with real wit. Expanded section. The episodes that got it right what they tell us about what was possible. Throughout the show's entire run, including the seasons that are most consistently criticized, there were individual episodes that demonstrated clearly what Family Guy could be when the creative conditions aligned. These episodes are worth examining not just as isolated high points, but as evidence of what was always available to the show, what the characters and the world could produce when the writing prioritized them. The Season 8 episode, Brian and Stewie, is the clearest possible proof of concept for a version of Family Guy that does not need cutaway gags to be compelling. In this episode, Brian and Stewie get locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode in conversation. There are no cutaways, there are no random gags. There is no secondary storyline in the Griffin household. It is two characters talking to each other, and the conversations they have are honest in ways that neither character is normally allowed to be. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box at the bank, a detail the show presents clearly as being connected to his complicated relationship with his own value and his own future. Stewie, responding to this, does something unexpected. He does not judge, does not deliver a speech, does not perform concern in the way the show's broader comic register might have demanded. He simply stays. He is present. He tells Brian that he matters. And the episode earns this moment because it has built to it carefully through an hour of genuine conversation. This episode represents what Family Guy could be when it trusted its characters to carry a story without the scaffolding of jokes and cutaways and pop culture references. The characters are capable of depth. The world the show built is capable of accommodating real emotional weight. The choice not to use those capacities more often was a choice, and episodes like this one demonstrate that clearly. The Season 5 episode Barely Legal showed Meg being written as a genuine character, someone whose feelings and desires were taken seriously by the episode, even as they were played for comedy. Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of pity, and the episode navigates the aftermath with more care than the show usually gave her storylines. Brian is embarrassed and avoidant. Meg is persistent and a little frightening in her intensity. The comedy comes from the specific texture of both characters' responses, rather than from a blanket dismissal of Meg's feelings as inherently ridiculous. The Road to episodes, particularly Road to Rhode Island from Season 2 and Road to Rupert from Season 5, remain the highest achievement of the Brian and Stewie dynamic at its most fully realized. In Road to Rhode Island, Brian travels to find his biological mother, and what he discovers and how he processes it is handled with real emotional intelligence. The episode does not turn away from the pain of what Brian finds. It sits with it. And Stewie is there throughout, not as comic relief, but as a genuine companion, someone whose loyalty to Brian is expressed through presence rather than through any particular gesture. Road to Rupert involves Brian and Stewie traveling across the country to recover Stewie's beloved stuffed bear Rupert after it was accidentally sold at a yard sale. The premise is inherently comic, but the episode treats it as though the stakes are real, because for Stewie, they are. His attachment to Rupert is not a joke in this episode. It is the emotional core around which everything else turns. And the episode is better for that commitment. These episodes, and others scattered throughout the show's run, are the counter-evidence to any argument that Family Guy's creative capacity was simply exhausted. The capacity was never exhausted. It was underused. The episodes that used it fully produced some of the best work in the history of adult animation. The show's frequent failure to draw on that capacity consistently is a creative mystery that these exceptional episodes make more rather than less puzzling. Expanded section, American Dad as Mirror, What a Different Road Looked Like. No accounting of Family Guy's characters and their transformations is complete without an extended look at what Seth MacFarlane's other major animated comedy did differently. American Dad premiered in February 2005, co-created by MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, and it was initially regarded by most critics and viewers as the lesser sibling. The setup was slightly more exotic: a CIA agent, an alien in the attic, a German-speaking goldfish who had once been a man, but the basic premise, dysfunctional American family, navigates absurd situations, seemed on paper like a Family Guy variant. What happened over the following years was a quiet reversal. American Dad got better, not in a flashy or dramatic way, but steadily, consistently, measurably. Its characters developed without losing their essential qualities. Its stories became more ambitious and more emotionally interesting. Its humor became more sophisticated rather than louder. And its central family, the Smiths, maintained something that the Griffins were losing: the genuine sense that these people cared about each other. Stan Smith, the show's patriarch, began as a fairly flat satirical figure. He was the conservative CIA agent, proud, rigid, jingoistic, deeply uncomfortable with anything that challenged his carefully maintained worldview. In the first season, the comedy of Stan was primarily the comedy of type. Here is the conservative American man. Watch him fail to adapt. It was not much more complicated than that. But the writers of American Dad were willing to let Stan grow. Not to change fundamentally, Stan remained recognizably himself across the show's entire run, but to develop, to become more than his most obvious characteristic. He became capable of vulnerability, of genuine love, of real recognition of his own failures. And crucially, he became capable of change that actually stuck. When Stan learned something about himself in an episode, that learning sometimes carried forward into subsequent episodes in ways that gave his character genuine arc across the seasons. Francine Smith, Stan's wife, avoided the fate that befell Lois Griffin. She remained warm. She remained someone whose love for her family was believable rather than performative. She had her own personality, her own flaws, her own storylines that did not depend on the men around her for their energy. She was, in short, a well-maintained character across the show's entire run. Roger the Alien became one of the most creative recurring comedy concepts in the history of adult animation. Roger's defining quirk, his ability to adopt entirely new personas, complete with different names, backstories, occupations, and mannerisms, gave the writers an infinite well of material that never ran dry because it was designed to constantly regenerate. Every episode could introduce a new Roger persona, each one more specific and outrageous than the last. The concept was brilliant not just because it was funny, but because it was structurally generous. It gave the writers something to work with that could not be exhausted in the way that a static character eventually can be. Compare this to what happened to Stewie. Stewie's original concept, the evil genius baby, was, as I argued earlier, enormously generative. The writers chose to retire it. Roger's concept, the alien who wears personas like costumes, was explicitly designed to be regenerative. The writers developed it. The different choices produce different outcomes, and the outcome difference is visible in how compelling each character remains after 2+ decades. American Dad also made a specific structural decision that had enormous downstream effects. It did not use cutaway gags as a primary comedic tool. The show told its stories in sequence, with plot and character doing the work that Family Guy delegated to cutaways. This forced the American Dad writing room to build episodes that functioned as complete narrative units, where each scene's comedy came from character and situation rather than from non-sequitur insertions. The result was a show that was better at storytelling because it could not fall back on the cutaway crutch. When American Dad moved from Fox to TBS after season 11, the transition was handled with the kind of creative stability that Family Guy never quite achieved in its transitions. The show found more creative freedom at TBS than it had at Fox, and the episodes produced in the TBS era are, by general consensus, some of the best in the show's history. The family did not disintegrate under the pressure of network change. The characters remained themselves. The tone remained consistent. The American Dad comparison is, as the transcript you may have heard before notes, the ultimate evidence that Family Guy's decline was not inevitable. Two shows, same creator, same network, same launch period. One of them declined. The other improved. The difference was in the specific choices made about characters, storytelling, and the creative priorities of the writing room. And the choices that produced improvement in American Dad were, in almost every case, the opposite of the choices that produced decline in Family Guy. Expanded section. The show that wouldn't end what continuation really means. One of the stranger aspects of Family Guy's cultural position in the 2020s is that it continues to be produced and broadcast, despite a ratings trajectory that would have terminated almost any live-action show years ago. The show went from 22 million viewers at its premiere to under 1 million in its most recent seasons, a loss of more than 95% of its original audience. By conventional metrics, this is a show that should not still be on television. The reason it continues is economic rather than creative, and that distinction matters when thinking about what the show has become. Animated television is substantially cheaper to produce than live-action television. The cost structure of Family Guy voice actors recording in a booth, animation produced overseas, no sets to build, or location fees to pay means that the show generates profit at viewership levels that would make a comparable live-action show economically unviable. Add to this the show's enormous library of episodes that continues to generate revenue through syndication on Adult Swim and Comedy Central and cable channels worldwide, through streaming on Hulu, through merchandise and licensing deals, and you have a property that creates value far beyond what its first-run viewership numbers suggest. The 2025 announcement of the multi-season renewal, extending Family Guy through the 2028-29 television season through season 27, was made in this economic context. Disney, which owns Fox's entertainment assets as part of its larger corporate structure, sees Family Guy as a reliable revenue-generating brand rather than as a creative endeavor that needs to justify its continuation on artistic grounds. That is a perfectly rational business position. It is simply not a position that tends to produce great television. What the continuation means for the characters is something worth sitting with. Characters who exist because of business decisions rather than creative necessity tend to become increasingly generic over time. Without the pressure of a creative purpose, without a creator who has something specific to say through these people, characters tend to drift toward whatever the most efficient deployment of their established traits looks like. Peter becomes more extreme. Brian becomes more insufferable. The comedy becomes louder to compensate for the loss of specificity. The characters stop feeling like people and start feeling like brand assets being managed. There are exceptions to this pattern, and Family Guy has produced some of them even in its later years. The occasional episode that catches lightning in a bottle and reminds you what these characters can do. The occasional season that has more energy and care than the one before it. The characters are not beyond recovery. They were not so thoroughly altered that the original qualities cannot be found in them still, given the right episode and the right creative conditions. But the structural reality of a show, produced primarily for economic reasons, is that the creative conditions are less likely to align consistently than they were when the show was driven by a creator's specific vision. The Griffins will continue to live on Spooner Street because it is profitable for them to do so, not because anyone has something essential to say through them. And in that gap between reason and art is where the final dark truth of Family Guy's character history lives. The characters were real, once, in the specific way that fictional characters can be real. They had interior lives. They had specific ways of being in the world that made them irreplaceable, that made it impossible to imagine substituting any other set of people for them and getting the same result. They were Peter and Lois and Brian and Stewie and Meg and Chris, and those names attached to something precise and particular and hard to replicate. What continued after the creative conditions changed is something related but not identical. It has the same names. It has the same designs. It has the same voice actors. It has the same town. But the precise, particular thing that made these characters themselves has been handled with varying degrees of care across the decades, and in the years when it was handled carelessly, something was lost that cannot be fully recovered even in the years when more care was applied. The Griffins continue, the show continues, and both of those facts are simultaneously true and complicated. They speak to the durability of what MacFarlane built, and to the ways in which what he built has been remade multiple times into something he might not recognize as his own. The dark truth, then, is not that Family Guy is a bad show. It has never been entirely bad. Even at its lowest creative points, it has produced good episodes. The dark truth is that it was once something genuinely special, a group of characters who felt irreplaceable, a world that had specific weight and texture, a comedy that managed to be both anarchic and warm simultaneously, and that specialness was not protected with the care it deserved. The characters were not lost overnight. They were changed slowly, by degrees, one season at a time, until the changes had accumulated into something significant. And the slowness of the change is what makes it darkest. It is easy to defend any single decision in isolation. It is only when you step back and look at the whole arc, the full 25-plus years of choices, that the shape of what was lost becomes visible. What remains is worth something. The archive of early episodes is worth everything. The characters at their best were genuinely among the best that the medium has produced. And that judgment, held alongside the complicated history of what the show became, is the only honest place to stand when looking at Family Guy and everything it has been. Final thoughts. What the night holds. There is a particular quality to the hours when you find yourself still awake and thinking about things that matter to you. The day's noise has settled. The demands of the ordinary world have gone quiet. And in that quiet, the things you actually care about, the stories that have moved you, the characters that have felt real, the cultural artifacts that shaped the way you understood the world, take on a presence that they cannot quite achieve in the brighter, louder hours. Family Guy has been, for a significant portion of the last 25 years of American television, one of those things. It has mattered to people. Not in the abstract way that successful entertainment matters not just as something popular, as something watched, but in the specific, personal way that characters matter when you have spent enough time with them to feel that you know them. The Griffins at their best were people you could know. That is not a small thing. In a medium full of animated families, it is actually a rare and specific achievement. The dark truths we have traced tonight, the Flanderization of Peter from lovable fool to something harder and crueler, the hollowing out of Brian from voice of reason to voice of self-interested pretension, the quiet retirement of the most original character in the show's original run, the decade of cruelty directed at a teenage girl who deserved so much better, the structural disruptions of cancellation and revival, and creator withdrawal and business-driven continuation, these are all real. They are documented in the episodes themselves, visible to anyone who looks at the show's full arc with honest eyes. But the truths that came before the dark ones are real too. The 3 seasons of brilliance before the show was canceled, the specific warmth of the Griffin household in those years, the precision of those early cutaway gags when they were still being used as character tools, the particular joy of Stewie in his full evil genius mode, building impossible things in his room and delivering impossible speeches in his tiny voice, the specific grace of Brian at his best, sitting with someone else's pain in a way that suggested genuine human depth. The normality of Meg in those first seasons, which was its own small miracle of empathy in the context of an animated comedy, all of these things coexist. The show was great, and then it was not as great, and then it was sometimes great again, and then it was less great than it had been, and has continued somewhere in that complicated range ever since. That is, in the end, the story of most long-running creative work. The ideal version exists in the memory, in the archive, in the specific episodes that fire exactly right. The lived experience of following the work across decades is more complicated and less pure. The Griffins are still out there in Quahog on Spooner Street, in their house on the corner, being whatever the current season requires them to be. And in the archive, in Season 1, in the pilot episode that aired after Super Bowl 33, they are also what they originally were, young, new, created with care by someone who had spent years working toward this specific thing and who got it right. Both of those Griffins are real. Both of those shows exist. And whichever version you love, or remember, or find yourself returning to when the night is quiet and you want something familiar and specific and true that love is legitimate, take care of yourselves. Subscribe if this kind of long, slow, careful analysis is what you come here for. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are right now and what time it is there. I love knowing who is awake with me in the dark. Until next time, sleep well. Additional deep dive. The specific texture of early humor, what made the jokes land. It is worth spending real time on what the early seasons of Family Guy actually did with their comedy, because the difference between the early humor and the later humor is not just a matter of quantity or shock value, it is a difference in the fundamental mechanics of how jokes were constructed and delivered. Understanding those mechanics helps explain why the early show hit so consistently and why the later show hit less often and less cleanly. The early Family Guy joke typically had 3 components working simultaneously. First, it operated on the level of character. The joke emerged from who the character was, rather than from what the writers wanted to say that week. Second, it operated on the level of situation. The humor arose from the specific circumstances of the scene, rather than from a general absurdity inserted into any convenient gap. Third, it operated on the level of timing. The early show had an exceptionally precise sense of how long a joke needed to run, when to cut away from it, and how to set up the next beat in a way that felt natural. These 3 components working together produced comedy that felt specific and earned rather than general and applied. When a joke landed in Season 1, you understood exactly why it was funny. You could see the logic of it, even if the logic was the logic of absurdism rather than of realism. The joke was not random. It had reasons. Consider Peter's early relationship with beer and the Drunken Clam. In the first 3 seasons, the Drunken Clam was a real place, a specific setting with specific atmosphere, a working-class bar in a small New England town where men who had worked all week sat at the bar and talked about things that mattered to them in ways that were rarely articulate. Peter's happiness in that setting was not just a joke about drinking. It was a character note about where Peter felt most himself, in a place where nobody expected him to be more than he was, where the standard was beer and conversation and not too much else. The comedy of Peter at the Drunken Clam came from recognizing something true about that kind of contentment and then exaggerating it in specifically Peter-shaped ways. Compare that to later season uses of the Drunken Clam, where the bar often became simply a location, a backdrop against which characters delivered dialogue that could have happened anywhere. The setting lost its texture. The bar stopped being the specific place it had been and became a generic bar. And in that shift, a layer of comedy was lost, the layer that came from the specific weight of the place and what it meant to the characters who inhabited it. The same is true of the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, where Peter worked in the first 3 seasons. The factory was a specific place. Mr. Weed, Peter's boss, was a specific kind of person. The relationship between Peter and the workplace, between a man of his intelligence and energy, and this particular job produced comedy that came from specificity. When Mr. Weed died at the end of season 3 and Peter lost the job, it was a genuine narrative transition. Something that had been real ended. The Pawtucket Brewery that replaced it had its own specificity, its own cast of coworkers, its own rhythms, its own comedy, but the original workplace's loss was felt as a real loss, which is only possible if the original was real enough to lose. The show's treatment of Lois's piano teaching in the first seasons is another example of the kind of specificity that produced good comedy through texture rather than through shock. Lois was a piano teacher. That fact meant she had a skill. It meant she had students. It meant she had a professional relationship with the community that was separate from her identity as Peter's wife and the mother of the Griffins. When episodes touched on her piano teaching, they were touching on a layer of Lois that existed independently of the domestic chaos, and that independence was itself funny in context. The idea that someone could maintain a professional life and identity amid everything the Griffin household generated daily. The later seasons largely abandoned Lois's piano teaching as a character detail. It would be referenced occasionally as a callback, but rarely developed as an active part of who she was. And the loss of that layer made Lois less. Not dramatically less, nobody would point to the absence of piano lessons as the key reason the show declined. But in the aggregate, across all the small specific details that were gradually dropped, the characters became less dense, less layered, less capable of producing the specific comedy that comes from knowing a person rather than just knowing their most prominent characteristic. The early show also understood something about pacing that later seasons lost. Not just joke pacing, though the early show's joke timing was impeccable, but the pacing of character revelation. The show was patient with its characters in ways that it later stopped being. It would let a scene play out without rushing to the next laugh. It would let a character sit in a moment of genuine feeling rather than cutting away to a joke the instant the emotional content appeared. This patience made the show's comic energy more effective when it arrived, because the audience had been in a quieter space and the contrast was greater. When Brian and Stewie had a genuine exchange in the early seasons, when the conversation between them reached the quieter register where their friendship was most visible, the show did not immediately undercut it with comedy. It let the feeling exist. And that willingness to let things be quiet and real for a moment is part of what gave the show its surprising emotional power. People did not expect to feel things watching Family Guy, and the early show consistently surprised them by providing feelings they had not anticipated alongside the comedy they had. Additional deep dive. The creation of a town Spooner Street. As character, one of the underappreciated achievements of early Family Guy is the creation of Quahog, the town, the neighborhood, the specific corner of fictional Rhode Island as a character in its own right. The best long-running comedies have this quality. The setting becomes as specific and recognizable as the people in it, so that the place itself carries meaning independent of what happens there in any given episode. Spooner Street was built with genuine care in the first 3 seasons. Every house had a specific occupant with a specific relationship to the Griffins. Joe to the left, Quagmire to the right. Cleveland across the way. The layout was not arbitrary. It created proximity that had comedic and dramatic implications. Peter's friends were literally his neighbors, which meant his domestic life and his social life were constantly overlapping. His disasters at home had immediate witnesses. His adventures with the group could begin literally at his front door. The town itself was Rhode Island, in the way that animated fictional towns are a heightened, compressed, exaggerated version of a real place, rather than a realistic depiction of one. Providence was nearby. Boston loomed on the horizon as a reference point for sports allegiances and regional identity. The ocean was present as a character in certain episodes, the sense of a New England coastal town with its particular character bleeding into the fiction. The Pawtucket Brewery was a real type of civic institution, the local employer, the place that organized a community's economic life and gave it a certain flavor. James Woods Regional High School was the town's high school. Not just Meg's school, not just the place where her social suffering played out, but a whole contained world with its own politics and hierarchies and characters. Connie D'Amico operated in that world. The teachers who appeared across different episodes had established personalities. The school was recognizable across multiple seasons as a specific institution with a specific identity. The Drunken Clam was the town's community center in the way that bars often function as community centers. In certain kinds of American towns, the place where men who worked with their hands and their backs spent their time, off, where local information circulated, where friendships were maintained in the specific register of men who do not talk about their feelings directly, but who are present for each other regularly. The early show understood this function. Later seasons used the bar more as a joke location and less as a social institution. The town as character was slowly lost across the middle and later seasons, partly because the show increasingly used location in a general way rather than a specific one. Quahog became a backdrop rather than a setting. The houses on Spooner Street became less differentiated. The town's institutional life, the schools, the workplaces, the bars, the church became less consistently developed. What remained was a recognizable visual shorthand for the location, without the accumulated specificity that had made it real in the early seasons. This loss parallels the loss that happened to the characters. Both the people and the place became less dense, less specific, less capable of generating meaning from their own established particularity. The comedy became more dependent on inserted gags and less dependent on the texture of a specific world that the audience had been invited to know. The recovery of some of this specificity in more recent seasons, as the show has, by various accounts, made efforts to reconnect with what made it work, has been partial. The world cannot be rebuilt exactly as it was, because the specific accumulation of knowledge and investment that produced the original world takes years to build and cannot be reconstructed quickly. But the attempt matters. The recognition that the world had become too generic and that something needed to be done to restore its particularity is itself a step in a more productive direction. Additional deep dive, the voice actors, the consistent thread. Through everything, through all the writing changes, all the character transformations, all the creative and structural disruptions, one thing about Family Guy remained constant from the first episode to the most recent: the voice cast. The same actors who gave the characters their voices in 1999 have continued to voice them, in almost every case, across the show's entire run. This consistency is remarkable in itself, and it has had effects on the show that are worth thinking about. Seth MacFarlane voicing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire across 25-plus years of production means that all four characters carry something of MacFarlane's presence in every episode, regardless of what the script requires them to do. A voice actor is not simply a delivery mechanism for dialogue. They bring their understanding of the character, their history with the character, their physical sense of the character's rhythm and energy to every recording session. When MacFarlane voices Peter saying something that the Season 1 version of Peter would never have said, there is a quality in the performance that reflects MacFarlane's own complicated relationship with where the character has gone. Alex Borstein's commitment to Lois across all these years is similarly remarkable. She has been recording Lois's voice since before the show premiered. She was there for the original pitch sessions, the early development work, the first season, and every season since. She has voiced Lois through the character's warmest periods and through the character's coldest ones, and through all of it has maintained something in the performance that points back toward who Lois was at the start. Even in the middle seasons, when Lois was written less well, Borstein's performance often found warmth that the script was not specifically requesting. Mila Kunis took over the role of Meg in Season 2, when she was 15 years old, and has played her ever since. She is now in her 40s. She has given Meg her voice across the character's entire range: the sympathetic Meg of the early seasons, the abused Meg of the middle years, the more assertive and capable Meg of the recent seasons. The continuity of Kunis's performance is a thread of consistency running through the character, even as the character's written treatment varied dramatically. When Meg was given genuinely good material, Kunis delivered it with intelligence and specificity. The voice never stopped being Meg, even when the script stopped being sure what Meg was. Seth Green's Chris and Patrick Warburton's Joe have similarly provided anchoring consistency across the show's run. Warburton's voice is so specific and so perfectly matched to Joe's particular kind of confident absurdity that it is genuinely impossible to imagine anyone else in the role. His willingness to lean into the character's most extreme qualities, the intensity, the determination, the complete sincerity about things that are inherently ridiculous, has kept Joe consistently funny, even in episodes where the writing around him was less careful than it might have been. The voice cast is the one element of Family Guy that has never been degraded by the same processes that degraded the writing. These actors have kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept bringing the characters to life with the same commitment they brought in the first season. The fact that the results were sometimes worse than others is not a failure of the performances. The voice actors gave the show more than it sometimes deserved. Additional deep dive. What younger viewers discover. The show seen fresh. There is something interesting that happens when Family Guy is encountered for the first time by someone who has no prior relationship to the show. Someone who comes to it on streaming, without knowledge of the original airing order or the cultural history, without the accumulated experience of watching the characters change across 25 seasons, someone who simply starts at the beginning and watches forward. Those viewers, discovering the show fresh, often have responses that are different from the responses of long-term fans. They do not feel the weight of what the characters became. They do not have the prior version of Brian in their heads when they watch a later season Brian episode. They are not comparing the Peter they see on screen to the Peter they remember from Season 1 because they have not seen Season 1 yet. They are simply watching a cartoon family in Rhode Island. And what they often discover watching the first 3 seasons with fresh eyes is that the show is better than they expected, better than its reputation in certain critical quarters had led them to anticipate. Funnier, warmer, more specific, the characters feel real in ways they had not been prepared for. The comedy lands in ways that surprise them. The early seasons of Family Guy, encountered fresh in the streaming era, reveal their quality without the complicating weight of knowing what came after. This is actually one of the most telling things about the early show's achievement. Work that is genuinely good does not require context to register its quality. You do not need to know that the show declined later to appreciate that the first 3 seasons were excellent. The excellence is self-contained. It does not depend on comparison. It is just good, in the way that good things are good specifically, precisely, in a way that cannot be replicated by attempting to approximate it without understanding what made it work. Younger viewers coming to the later seasons first sometimes have an inverted experience. They start with the current show, find it reasonably entertaining as a background watch, and then encounter the early seasons through recommendation or curiosity and are startled by how different it feels. They had thought they knew what Family Guy was. The early seasons show them something else, something more careful, more specific, more invested in its characters than what they had been watching. This inversion is itself a kind of verdict. The show's later seasons produce a certain kind of viewer, someone who watches Family Guy as ambient entertainment, who enjoys it without feeling any particular pull toward it, who would not describe it as something that matters to them. The early seasons produce a different kind of viewer, someone who gets pulled in, who starts caring about the characters, who finds themselves thinking about the show in the spaces between watching it. The early seasons made something that mattered. The later seasons make something that passes time. Both have their place in the landscape of television, but only one of them will be remembered. Closing extension. The last word on the Griffins. We have been in this together for a long time now, tracing the long, complicated, sometimes beautiful and sometimes painful story of a family that never existed, living in a town that was never built in a state that is real, but that never quite looked the way this show depicted it. We have followed Peter from the happy-go-lucky toy factory to the Pawtucket Brewery and everywhere in between. We have listened to Brian's dry commentary become, eventually, something less dry and less honest. We have watched Stewie build weapons and then watch him set them down. We have sat with Meg through years of treatment she did not deserve, and arrived at a tentative and partial recovery that still feels incomplete. We have seen Lois's warmth flicker and hold, across the long weather of the show's run. We have watched the town change around them. The Drunken Clam is still there. Spooner Street is still there. The Griffin House, with its particular architecture, is still there. The family that lives in it is still recognizably the family that moved in back in 1999, even as the specific people inside have been worn somewhat by the years. What endures across all of it is the original conception, the specific thing that Seth MacFarlane made in his apartment in 3 months, in 1998, by hand, because he believed in it enough to do it that way. The pilot that Fox executives watched and responded to. The premiere that 22 million people tuned in for after a Super Bowl. That thing, whatever it was, that specific combination of character and humor and warmth, was real. It worked. It produced a show that people loved in ways they did not expect to love a cartoon. The dark truths do not cancel that out. The decline does not erase the beginning. The loss of what the characters were does not erase the fact that they were it. The Griffins, at their best, were one of the great families in the history of American television comedy. Not in the sense of being the most acclaimed or the most awarded, though the show did receive genuine critical recognition, including that historic Emmy nomination in 2009, but in the sense of being genuinely beloved in the specific way that requires characters to feel real. People loved Peter Griffin the way you love someone who exasperates you constantly, but who you would miss tremendously if they were gone. People loved Brian Griffin the way you love a friend who is brilliant and broken, and who you root for even when they cannot quite get out of their own way. People loved Stewie Griffin with the particular delight you feel for something that is completely original and unlike anything else you have encountered. People loved Lois Griffin the way you love the person who holds everything together without being given sufficient credit for doing so. And yes, people even loved Meg Griffin in the way that you love the person you recognize from inside a situation that is not fair and that they have not earned and that they have endured anyway. Meg was loved. She deserved more of it from the show itself than she was given. But from the audience, the affection was real. The last thing worth saying, on a night this long and this deep into the history of a fictional family, is simply this. The things we love in fiction are expressions of what we love in life. The warmth we respond to in a television show is the warmth we are looking for in the world. The characters who feel real to us are real in the ways that matter for what we take from them. The Griffin family, in their best moments, showed us something about family life, about the chaos and affection and relentless forgiveness that makes families possible. That was true even though it was animated, even though it was exaggerated, even though it was surrounded by cutaway gags and physical comedy and a talking dog drinking a martini. Truth shows up in strange containers. Sometimes it shows up in the gap between a baby villain's plot for world domination and his mother's complete, oblivious affection for him. Sometimes it shows up in the space between a lovable idiot's disasters and his wife's patient, stubborn love. Sometimes it shows up in the dry, sad humor of a dog who wanted to be a writer and never quite got there. It was there, in those early seasons. However complicated the story became afterward, it was genuinely there. That is the last truth, underneath all the dark ones. Something real was made. And real things last. Good night. Additional section. The original writer's room names behind the magic. When people discuss why the early seasons of Family Guy had such a consistent quality, the conversation tends to focus on Seth MacFarlane. And MacFarlane's creative vision was certainly central. But a television show is never one person. It is a room full of people working together under pressure and deadline. And the specific group of writers that MacFarlane assembled for the show's first 3 seasons had a collective identity and a collective sensibility that was as responsible for the early show's success as any individual. Talent. Chris Sheridan was one of the most significant contributors to the show's early voice. He wrote some of the most emotionally resonant episodes in those first 3 seasons, including moments that required the show to hold multiple tones simultaneously to be funny and touching and unsettling all at once without any of those qualities canceling the others out. His writing had a specific quality of layering, of building scenes that meant more than they appeared to mean on the surface, that fit the show's best instincts perfectly. Danny Smith, who voiced multiple recurring characters including the evil monkey and Ernie the giant chicken, was also a writer in the room from early in the show's history and stayed with it longer than many of his original colleagues. His dual role as performer and writer gave him an insider's understanding of how the show's comedy worked at the level of both scripting and execution. There is something that a performer knows about timing and rhythm that a pure writer sometimes does not, and Smith's writing reflected that knowledge. Gary Janetti was another early contributor whose work helped shape the show's particular blend of sophistication and absurdity. He had a facility with language, a precise awareness of word choice and comic rhythm that is visible in the episodes he worked on. His dialogue had a crispness that fit the show's faster register perfectly. Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan collaborated closely, often sharing writing credit on episodes. Their work together had a specific quality of comedic escalation, building jokes through accumulation rather than through single punchlines. layering absurdity on absurdity until the cumulative weight of it produced something that was funnier than any individual element would have been. This was a Family Guy specialty in the early seasons, and Goldman and Donovan were among the people who understood it best. Matt Weitzman, who would later go on to help shape American Dad's creative direction, was present in the early Family Guy room and carried elements of the original show's sensibility into his subsequent work. The quality of American Dad's character writing, particularly the consistency with which Stan Smith was developed across many seasons, reflects lessons learned partly from what worked in Family Guy's first 3 seasons and partly from an understanding of what had not been sustained. Mike Barker, another American Dad co-creator, was similarly formed by his early Family Guy experience. Both Barker and Weitzman took specific things from their time in the original room, things about how to maintain a character's core identity across long periods of production, about how to build a world with enough specificity that it can generate its own comedy without constant injection of external material, and applied them to the show they built together. These writers were not simply executing MacFarlane's vision. They were contributing to it, shaping it, pushing it in directions that MacFarlane himself might not have found alone. The show that emerged from that room was a genuinely collective creation, and the quality of the room was inseparable from the quality of the result. When the room changed, when the cancellations and revivals scattered these specific people and replaced them with others, the collective sensibility changed too. Not immediately, not completely, but measurably across time. Additional section: the cultural moment. Why 1999 was the right time. Family Guy arrived at a specific moment in American culture, and that timing mattered for how the show was received and what it was able to do. The late 1990s were an interesting time for animated comedy. The Simpsons had been running for a decade and had demonstrated conclusively that animation could be a vehicle for sophisticated satire and genuine emotional storytelling. South Park had arrived 2 years earlier and had immediately staked out a more transgressive, more politically charged corner of the territory. The animation landscape was expanding, and there was real appetite for what came next. Family Guy's particular contribution to this landscape was the synthesis of things that had not previously been combined in quite that way. It was funnier than it needed to be, the jokes came faster and weirder than the premise required, which created an experience of comedic abundance. It was warmer than its premise suggested, a show built on the chaos of a very flawed family somehow communicated genuine love without contradicting its comedy. And it was stranger than it looked, the cutaway structure, the pop culture references, the willingness to abandon internal logic for a better gag. All of these were formal innovations that did not register as innovations because they were executed with enough confidence that they seemed inevitable. The Super Bowl premiere was part of the timing too. Having 22 million people watch your pilot episode means you enter the culture with a full tank of public awareness that most shows spend years trying to build. The audience that watched the premiere did not discover Family Guy gradually. They encountered it all at once, which gave it a different cultural velocity than shows that had to build word of mouth over time. Within weeks of its premiere, Family Guy was a cultural reference point in a way that most shows never become. The Adult Swim reruns in 2003 and 2004 constituted a second cultural moment, equally important in its own way. By the time the reruns began, the original audience was older. The people who had watched the premiere in 1999 as teenagers were now in their early 20s, with different viewing habits and different cultural contexts. And the Adult Swim block reached specifically into that demographic, the late-night cable audience of young adults watching cartoons in the small hours. Family Guy hit that audience at exactly the right age and at exactly the right time, and the cult that formed around the reruns was different from the audience that had watched the original broadcast. It was younger, more passionate, more willing to evangelize the show to people who had not seen it. The DVD sales that accompanied the rerun's success were partly driven by this audience wanting to share the show, wanting to put it in the hands of people who had missed it. This kind of layered cultural accumulation is unusual and important. Family Guy had 2 separate moments of cultural discovery: the original 1999 premiere and the 2003 to 2004 Adult Swim period, and both of them brought different audiences to the same show. The show that came back in 2005 was returning to an audience that was actually larger and more diverse than the audience it had left in 2002. That expansion created both an opportunity and a pressure. The opportunity to reach more people with something genuinely excellent, and the pressure to serve an audience that had different expectations and different relationships to the material. The show's response to that pressure, the cutaway-heavy, character-exaggerating, shock-escalating approach of the revival era, was in some ways a misreading of what the audience actually wanted. The cult that had formed around the Adult Swim reruns loved the show for what it had been, not for what it might become. They had bonded with the first 3 seasons. What they wanted, in 2005, was more of what had made those seasons work. What they got was a show that had absorbed a different set of assumptions about what its audience wanted and had decided that bigger, louder, and more shocking was the way to give it to them. Some of those assumptions were not entirely wrong. The clips that went viral on YouTube in 2005 and 2006 were often exactly the kind of outrageous, self-contained moments that the revival era specialized in. The internet amplified Family Guy's most extreme content in ways that created an impression that extremity was the show's core appeal. But the people who were actually fans of the show, who had watched the first 3 seasons on Adult Swim and gone out to buy the DVDs, knew that the extremity was a seasoning, not the dish. And when the revival treated the seasoning as the dish, they noticed. Additional section: the animation through the years, how the look changed the feel. Family Guy's animation has gone through multiple distinct phases across its run, and each phase has had real effects on how the characters felt and how the comedy landed. This is not a peripheral concern. Animation style in a cartoon comedy is directly connected to how jokes register, because so much of comedy in animation comes from visual timing, from the specific quality of character, movement, and expression, from the physical texture of the world in which the characters exist. The pilot episode and first season had a somewhat rough, handmade quality that was characteristic of animation from that period. The character designs were slightly different from what they would become. Peter's eyebrows sat differently on his face. The overall visual style was less polished, but there was energy in the roughness. The animation felt alive in the way that things handmade by people who care about them feel alive, imperfect, specific, made with attention. Rough Draft Studios handled the animation for seasons 2 and 3, and their work is generally regarded as the visual peak of the original run. The characters moved with expressiveness and physicality that matched the show's comedic energy. When Peter fell down, the fall had weight. When Stewie made one of his theatrical expressions of contempt, the expression was drawn with enough specificity that you could read the exact quality of the contempt. The animation was doing work contributing to the comedy rather than simply rendering it. When the show returned in season 4, the animation had changed. A different studio produced a cleaner, smoother look that was technically more polished in some respects but lost some of the expressiveness of the earlier seasons. The characters moved in ways that were more controlled, less spontaneous feeling. The outlines were thicker. The movement was more contained. The show looked more professional and felt, paradoxically, less alive. Subsequent seasons brought additional changes as different studios handled production. The animation for seasons 6 and 7, handled partly by digital animation, had a flatness to the character outlines and a stiffness to the movement that was widely noticed by fans who were paying attention. Some episodes during this period were handled by a studio using digital drawing tablets that produced a visual quality that was cleaner but also more rigid, with characters occasionally looking slightly off-model in ways that the original hand-drawn animation had not. These changes in animation style were not trivial. Comedy in animation is deeply physical. The way a character's face moves when they react to something is part of the joke. The specific quality of a character's physical disaster, Peter falling down a flight of stairs, Stewie's expression when one of his plans fails, is inseparable from whether the moment is actually funny or just something happening on screen. When the animation became stiffer and less expressive, the physical comedy suffered. The moments that should have gotten big laughs got smaller ones, and the deficit accumulated across seasons. The most recent seasons of Family Guy have benefited from the overall advancement in animation production technology that has happened across the industry. The current show is more visually consistent, more reliably on model than many of the middle-era seasons were. But consistency is not the same as expressiveness, and the specific quality of expressive life that made the early animation special has not been fully recovered. The show looks fine. It does not look like it did in Season 2, when Rough Draft Studios was at their peak and the animation had genuine vitality. Additional section: What the merchandise tells you. One of the more revealing ways to understand how Family Guy's characters have been received over time is to look at what has been merchandised, what has sold, and what imagery from the show has attached itself to the broader culture. Merchandise is a fairly honest mirror of what resonates with audiences, because people spend money on things they actually want to live with. The Family Guy merchandise that has moved best over the years is overwhelmingly focused on specific character moments from the early seasons. Peter Griffin in the pose from the opening credits, Stewie with his ray gun, Brian with his martini glass, Meg in her pink beanie in a pose that suggests her characteristic combination of hope and resignation. These are images from the first 3 seasons or from the characters as they existed in their most iconic early configurations. You rarely see merchandise celebrating specific moments from the middle or later seasons. Nobody is selling a Peter abandons Lois to the shark coffee mug. The Quagmire delivers his speech to Brian moment, however significant to the show's character history, did not produce a celebrated collector's item. The cultural artifacts that have attached themselves to Family Guy are almost entirely from the early periods, the moments when the characters were most fully themselves and the show was at its most specific. This selective merchandising reveals something important. The culture's relationship with Family Guy is primarily a relationship with a specific earlier version of the show. The brand that exists in the cultural imagination, the brand that sells things, is the brand of the first 3 seasons. Everything that happened afterward exists in a different relationship with the audience, one that is more conditional, more ambivalent, less attached to specific beloved moments. The Funko Pop figures for Family Guy characters, for example, emphasize the iconic visual qualities of each character. Stewie with his ray gun, Peter in his familiar outfit, Brian with his martini. These are the character attributes that a global audience recognizes and wants to own a small plastic representation of. They are early season attributes. The later season versions of these characters, the crueler Peter, the more insufferable Brian, the character who replaced evil genius Stewie, have not generated the same kind of affectionate commercial relationship. This is ultimately a form of audience verdict. Not the rating book kind, not the Nielsen household kind, but the spending your own money kind. People put their money into the version of Family Guy that they love. And the version they love overwhelmingly is the version that existed before the specific choices that degraded each character were made. The culture has registered its preferences clearly. The show has sometimes not been listening. Final additional section: 30 seconds in the dark, what we take with us. There is something specific that happens when a television show has been with you long enough. It becomes part of the furniture of your inner life. Not in a grand or literary way, necessarily. Nobody is comparing Family Guy to Tolstoy, but in the way that the things you have spent thousands of hours with inevitably become part of the texture of your memory and your sense of humor and your understanding of the world. The Griffin family has been in a lot of people's lives for a very long time. That duration produces attachment, even when the object of the attachment is imperfect, even when it has disappointed you, even when you would make a different show if you could. What do we actually take with us from all of those hours? From the early brilliance and the middle struggles and the late partial recovery? From Peter at his best and Brian at his best and Stewie at his original, unrepeatable, genuinely extraordinary best? We take the specific feeling of the first time something made us genuinely surprised. The first time a Family Guy joke arrived from a direction we did not anticipate and landed with more force than we were prepared for. We take the warmth of the early episodes, that specific quality of a family that was clearly dysfunctional and clearly loving in the same breath, that made the chaos feel like something that belonged to people rather than to a formula. We take Stewie's voice. That specific, clipped, theatrical delivery of things that no one-year-old has any business saying, delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who takes his own importance entirely seriously. We take Brian's particular quality of intelligent longing, the sense of someone reaching for more than they have, and not quite getting there, but never entirely giving up either. We take Peter's laugh, his specific brand of delight in things that are genuinely terrible ideas, His ability to commit completely to something that everyone around him can see is going to end in disaster, and that he pursues anyway with the full force of his personality. We take Meg's face when someone is kind to her. That specific, slightly disbelieving expression that appears in the rare moments when someone treats her as though she matters, the expression of someone who has been surprised by kindness often enough to be genuinely surprised by it, who has not yet been able to build a frame around being well treated because it happens so rarely that it cannot form a pattern. That expression, specific and honest, is one of the most human things in the entire run of the show. We take Lois's particular combination of patience and edge, the specific quality of someone who loves genuinely and exhaustedly, who has chosen a life that requires more of her than it was advertised to require, and who has made that choice again every morning for decades without quite making it look like a choice, because it has become so thoroughly who she is. These things, specific images, specific feelings, specific moments of recognition that connected the fictional world to something real, are what the best television gives you. Family Guy gave them to us, in concentrated form, in its first 3 seasons, and scattered across its subsequent decades in the best individual episodes of the revival era. The dark truths we have examined tonight do not erase these gifts. They complicate them, as all truths do when examined closely, but they do not erase them. The characters exist in the archive. The early seasons are there to be rewatched. The specific thing that MacFarlane made, at its best, is preserved and accessible, and still capable of producing the responses it always produced. The laugh, the wince, the unexpected feeling, the recognition. And on nights like this one, when the hour is late and the world is quiet, and there is something comforting about going deep into the things that have mattered to you, that is exactly enough. Thank you for staying this long. If you made it all the way to the end of this journey, you are the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit that like button, subscribe if you have not yet, and leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is where you are, which character you have always felt most connected to. I want to know. Sleep well, wherever you are.